Call to order a regular meeting for the Normal Town Council for September 3rd, 2019. Please call the roll.
Mayor Coos?
Here.
Mr. McCarthy?
Here.
Mrs. Cummings?
Here.
Mr. Nord?
Here.
Ms. Smith?
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Here.
Mr. Preston?
Here.
We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We're going to begin with the public comment, and we have quite a list tonight of people who want to speak. And our rules, our public comment goes for a half hour. So I'm going to ask speakers to honor the 3-minute limit so we can get as many people up here to speak. The way it looks right now, the list is beyond our half-hour limit, but we'll see what happens. First speaker is Jan Murphy.
Good evening. My name is Jan Murphy, and I serve as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost at Illinois State University. As the 2019-2020 academic year gets underway, I just wanted to stop by and express my appreciation for the excellent collaborative relationship Illinois State University enjoys with the town of Normal. This is going to be a very exciting year for Illinois State in that we are enrolling the largest and most diverse freshman class in more than 3 decades. At a time when many public universities in Illinois are struggling with enrollment demands, Illinois State remains the 3rd largest educator of Illinois residents among the state's 12 public universities. ISU is also the 2nd largest employer in McLean County and a huge economic driver, contributing more than $500 million annually to the local economy. Illinois State's success is a testament to the high-quality leadership of our 19th president, my boss, Dr. Larry Dietz, who, by the way, is traveling on university business in Texas today. Our achievements are also the result of an outstanding faculty, a committed and caring support staff, an academically motivated student body, and an engaged alumni, many of whom live in the Twin Cities. The local community plays a significant role in our ability to recruit and retain a robust student enrollment and attract high-quality faculty and staff members. We hear time and time again from students, from prospective students, and from their families about the many attributes of Uptown Normal. In particular, Uptown Station and its close proximity to Amtrak and bus service, high-quality dining and shopping venues, a full-service pharmacy and store, a hotel just 1 block from campus, a moving theater, and the gathering space in Uptown Circle. We also enjoy our many collaborations with the town, including fire and rescue services, safe and clean living spaces for our off-campus students, the Illinois State Art Gallery in Uptown Station, and our annual homecoming partnerships. Just a couple of weeks ago, it was the pleasure of Gamma Phi Circus to lend its name and talent to Uptown Normal Sweet Corn Festival. Gamma Phi is the oldest and finest collegiate circus in the country, and they were honored to perform at one of Normal's most popular and well-attended annual events. It's a little wonder this community rates as one of the top 40 college towns in America based on quality of life and in the top 10 for arts and entertainment opportunities. In addition, we can be proud to be ranked among the top 5 destinations for smaller communities in the U.S. for recent graduates. So thank you all for your efforts to provide a welcoming environment for our students, our faculty, staff members, and our visitors. We consider all of you Redbirds, and while I'm here, I'll mention our first home football game is next Saturday night. So thank you again, and in the words of my boss, go you Redbirds.
Our next speaker is Joe Slane.
Hi, my name is Joe Slane. I'm from Medici and Normal, and I just wanted to speak real briefly, somewhat of the same, commenting about the Uptown Normal and what it kind of means to us at Medici and beyond. The Uptown Normal and the growth that's been shown in Uptown Normal and hoping to continue is bringing in lots of jobs, foot traffic to Uptown Normal that not only supports the business itself, but those around it. Bringing jobs to the students, to local people in the community, and bringing lots of opportunity along with that. Beyond offering those jobs, the feedback that we get from locals and from visitors have been very positive about Uptown continuously. And we've enjoyed a great deal in the last 11 years being part of that growth and part of that community. Uptown has become a community center in Normal and supports a lot of local businesses, ISU, and the town. And without that support from the town and the encouragement that we get from the town, it'd be very difficult for us to expand and keep on that growth, and we appreciate that greatly from all of you. The growth and success of Uptown has let us continue to offer a lot of family activities and events through Uptown, not just through Medici, but those that we see through the town offering also, bringing a lot of people into the community center. This is encouraged with the CDM, the ISU, the train station, and a lot more. These things are funded by the success that we have all through the year and by the encouragement and support that we get through the town on a continuous basis. One of the draws in a community is a safe area for people to find a center of community, more so than just a Walmart parking lot. Somewhere that they can go for activities, they can go for food, they can go for shopping, that involves the center of activity. And we appreciate being part of that and hope to see the success of that growing in the future. A place where people can live and still find places to go and enjoy themselves with so many activities throughout the year. I just wanted to let you know how much we support Uptown, and we want to see the growth of the business for not only for ourselves, but those businesses around us, and those two hopefully come in the near future. And hope that the community continues to offer that support and allow us to show an ideal community that has been brought to Central Illinois that you don't find in a lot of other places.
Our next speaker is Cheryl Gaines.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's kind of weird being on this side, but I have a few things I want to say. I'm Cheryl Gaines at 8 Payne Place. I'm here tonight just to give a little historical perspective. I served on the council here for 24 years, and I was part of the council when we began the process of becoming debt-free. It included, pay-as-you-go for things that were able to be saved for in a reasonable period of time. The same is still being done today. The purpose of becoming debt-free was to be in the position to do the Uptown project. There was always a plan. We worked in it. I believe you still do work with a 5-year plan. Plan your work and work your plan is the mantra that then Mayor Carricker made us live by. As we planned our work, we included how everything would be paid for. A TIF district was formed, and it was to pay for things within the TIF district, meaning only increased assessed value property within taxes within the TIF paid the debt. No property taxes pay for the TIF debt if the property is outside of the TIF district. So unless you are in the Uptown, your property's in the Uptown, your property taxes are not paying for the Uptown debt. They are paying for police and fire pensions and all that goes along with that. And those pensions are mandated by the state of Illinois, not by the town of Normal. Our work was carefully planned and laid out so that the new property tax increase due to increased assessed valuation within the TIF district would and still helps to pay off the debt. Schools and other taxing body boards have to approve the TIF and vote on it. They understood that they still would receive the same amount of property taxes in the TIF district that they received prior to the TIF being formed. They just don't gain the new taxes from the increased assessed valuation of the property taxes until the end of the TIF in 2026. Then they will have a windfall of new money. And that I'm speaking of the already developed properties in the TIF. There were lots of public forums, plannings, meetings, and charrettes that occurred to include all interested citizens in the planning process for the Uptown project. It was never done behind closed doors, but rather with a spotlight on it and lots of input and information sharing. About $145 million return on a $90 million investment, that isn't bad. I bet most anyone here would just really be glad to have that kind of return on their personal investments. I know I would. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of misinformation and, quite frankly, disinformation about the Uptown and the finances. Tax abatements and incentives and tax TIF districts can be tricky. That is why the council studies, learns from experts and others who have used these tools and types of experiences in the past so that the council can make the best, most well-informed decisions. The Uptown was not a thrown-together dangerous plan. It was smart, well-planned, and quite a prosperous investment, not only for the town, the citizens, but also for Illinois State University. When Illinois State does well, Normal does well. When the town of Normal does well, Illinois State does well, as referenced a little bit ago. I want to encourage the town of Normal to keep moving forward smartly. Keep planning your work. Yeah, sometimes those bold moves of progression into the future can be scary, but boy, they are worth it. Thank you for your time.
Our next speaker is Mike Batika.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Mike Matika, 402 East Lincoln Street in Normal. There have been some good comments here this evening, and I also want, like Ms. Gaines did, think back and the wonder of what Uptown has become as a model for a small city community and development is something I think we forget locally. We've got a gem here that this council and this community had a vision and made happen. I'm old enough to remember before Medici and the menu choice in Uptown Normal was pepperoni or sausage. We've got a community that now has first-class restaurants. We've got a place that is attractive. We've got a town recreation and facility staff that creates a wonderful climate of events that uses the circle to make things happen in our community. And I think it's also important with what the provost said about Illinois State University. When we look at our state universities, many are in trouble. ISU is a first-class institution. ISU has wonderful facilities, has wonderful faculty and staff, but people come to ISU not just for the beauty of the quad, but because we have an attractive community adjoining it. And part of that is the investment that this town has made in its TIF district and in using funds very judiciously to grow a unique model here that I think needs to continue, and I would encourage you to continue. The other thing, as a member of Labor's Local 362, you have brought jobs to this community. You brought good paying jobs, you created apprenticeship opportunities for people, and those are folks that then further enrich the community through their property taxes and their purchases to keep the community stable. And by requiring prevailing wages, you have made sure that everything done in Uptown is done with a quality advantage and done by trained people. And I hope as the new brew pub, Fulia, begins its deliberation tonight, they will carry on that tradition and also use your model of using local trades and local people to build their facility. But I want to commend you to continue the vision, to continue the good work, and to continue to build a community that is the envy of many, not only in the state, but across the country. It's a job well done. It didn't happen overnight, and it will continue to happen with your inspiration and your good example. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Andy Shirk. Doesn't seem to be here. We'll put him to the end of the list. Our next speaker then is Patrick Hoban. Sorry, there are two Patricks here tonight.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Patrick Hoban, I'm the CEO of the Bloomington Normal Economic Development Council. Also a fun fact, I was a student here at Illinois State back in 1997, and the only reason we really had to come to the Uptown area was to hit the trail, so I can say I'm very impressed on what's gone on since then. I just want to talk about the TIF as well. I mean, I'm doing economic development here in Illinois. We don't really have a lot of tools, especially whenever we're competing with the likes of Texas. Texas hands out cash. I mean, we normally operate in a tax break world, but TIFs can be very successful. And in fact, before I took this job, we had our Illinois Economic Development Association conference here in Bloomington, and your TIF in Uptown was one of the models to show everybody else how you're supposed to do a TIF. They went over all the finances, how you guys handle the bonding, and how the return had came through, and really invested in the quality of place. Because right now, as we battle for workforce, battle for students like ISU does, it's really about having this quality of place, which leads to a quality of life. And so I just wanted to commend you guys on the work that you've done with this TIF and what it's really changed, especially since '97 when I was here. So keep up the good work. I'm looking forward to working with you guys and seeing what else we can do down here. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Rachel Heil-Broad.
Evening, Council. Rachel Heilbrod. Thanks very much for the chance to speak. I'm going to keep it brief so we can get everybody in. But I just wanted to thank you, as others have before me, for the investment in Uptown. I came up in Bloomington Normal through high school, proud NCHS grad. No offense, but I hightailed it. Didn't check my shoulder. I was not interested in staying. It was beautiful for what it was, but it didn't seem to attract me in the long run. So 6 years later, sometime in Chicago, sometime in New York City, and I'm back, and I'm really excited about it. The work in Uptown especially, I think, is indicative of energy and momentum in this town, which is really exciting to me. The little metaphor that I kept thinking of was when I was headed out in 2013-ish, all the saplings were in, but they hadn't really taken root much. And now Uptown is matured and flourishing. And it's a lovely thing to watch. There's kids on the circle, there's music, there's light, there's water. It's everything you could want. And again, coming from some time in Chicago and some time in New York, these are the things you don't get in big city America, which is really unique to small town America or middle city America, whatever we're aspiring to. So I wanted to thank you for it. I'm excited to learn more. I have lots of anecdotal evidence, but not so many numbers. So I'm excited to be here for the presentation, but I wanted to thank you for your work, and it's really good to be home.
Our next speaker is Jonathan Seiden.
Good evening, Council. Jonathan Seiden, 1100 Beach Street, Building 12B. I want to also echo some of the comments that people have made before me and share my comments of support for the Uptown redevelopment, in particular from two perspectives that I have. The first perspective is sort of maybe an embodiment of some of the truth that the previous people have spoken about in terms of how attractive Uptown Normal really is. I grew up in New York. I'm a new resident to Normal. I moved here over the past couple of months, earlier this summer. And I have certainly had my fair share of conversations over the past year or so with people saying, yes, it really is called normal. It's 60,000 people or so. There's tons of corn, pretty much, yeah. But what I always try to kind of slide in before the end of the conversation is, just wait until you come and visit, and you'll actually get a chance to see what it's like there. And I imagine people sort of stepping off the train and seeing Uptown and getting a chance to actually appreciate what Uptown has really done here, and some of the things that have, as people have said, attracted me to move here. Not only made it possible for me to move here, but also has made me really proud to have moved here and excited to share it with my friends and family who don't quite understand just yet. The second perspective that I want to share is that over the past 5 years or so since I first visited Normal, I've had the opportunity to work for local governments, actually, city government in both Chicago and in New York City. I've also participated on independent policy research commissions, worked for policy think tanks, and really had an opportunity to study and start to appreciate what the roles and responsibilities of local government are, and the power that local government has to build communities that will be able to face and conquer some of the biggest challenges that we have in society in terms of social justice, criminal justice, climate change, economic inequality. And so I feel like from that perspective, I'm also really able to appreciate what you all have done and what council members of past have been able to do with Uptown Normal in terms of really showing that Normal is up to those responsibilities and ready to do the on-the-ground work of local governance that might not even really be possible in places like Chicago and New York City at this point. So I want to echo some of the previous comments that this is a really important model, and that the work that you all have done and council members of past have done will benefit generations of American families, not only in Normal, but also in other cities that are smart enough to look to the example that Normal is setting. So I want to commend you. Thank you for your success. I look forward to sharing Uptown Normal with my friends and family when they come to visit, and I also look forward to supporting more efforts like this moving forward.
Next speaker is the other Patrick. Patrick Dullard.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. My name is Patrick Dullard. I reside at 807 Broadway in Normal. I'm here tonight on behalf of my role as the president of the Friends of the Constitution Trail. An Omnibus Agenda tonight is item 5E, which calls for resurfacing of Constitution Trail from Vernon Avenue to Veterans Parkway. I can tell you, as the advocacy group and the people that handle outreach regarding the trail, we hear a lot about the condition of that section of the trail. I commend the town for having the foresight to budget for maintenance and to keep it in good working order. This particular stretch has been a challenge that the town has been working on for a number of years. They've done Great Creek restoration. They've been working on improving the gardens there, and this is the last step. So I encourage you to support that on the omnibus bill, and thank you for your time.
Next speaker is Dave Shields.
I'm Dave Shields. I live at 701 Broadway in Normal, a beautiful home which could be yours. There are 400 or so folks who work for the town of Normal, and I think they all deserve a moment in the spotlight. And tonight's agenda is going to showcase the world-class work of the finance department here. Man, how lucky are we to have one of the best financial organizations in the United States working for us? And that's not just my opinion, that's an audited fact. This department has won awards, plural, for operations, for transparency. Their work has earned the town the Fitch AAA bond rating, which fewer than 10% of all the communities in the United States earn, and the town has had it for 10 years running in a state which does not make budgetary excellence easy. And transparency-wise, last fiscal year's annual budget received the Government Finance Officers Association's Distinguished Budget Presentation Award, meeting criteria as a policy document, as an operations guide, as a financial plan, and as a communications device. Thanks for even wanting to. It sounds like you're taking accounting rules and spreadsheets and bank accounts and the 10 Commandments and the pantograph and throwing them in a blender and coming up with a Peabody. The finance department implements and monitors the town's budget. They do it consistently, conservatively. They are on the ball. They react quickly to opportunities and to unexpected challenges. They monitor our debt, which, as we heard, is obligation on investment primarily, and we've heard what that return on investment looks like. We haven't heard that the service on that debt is only about 5.2%. Now, how many households spend 5.2% of their income on their mortgages and their vehicle loans and their student loans and their fill-in-the-blank loans? But we got that going for us. And we're going to hear more about all of this from the experts. And I got a few seconds left, but in terms of expertise, I do want to point out that the finance department employees have around combined 100 years of service doing this work for the town. So maybe it's not a surprise that they're getting it right. But again, they're not the only ones getting it right. Every one of the 400 employees of this town make it the best place to plant a business or start your adult education or make a home. It's because of all those good people doing the right things the right way for the right reasons that Normal is the best small city in America. And Ms. Reese, I ask you to please say thank you to all of them for us, and thank you too.
Our next speaker is Carl Seeler.
Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. I've had to revise my notes as various speakers came before me, so I'll try to be coherent here. As one of the other speakers said, the council has indeed had an Uptown plan in place for years or even decades. From the perspective of government control and central planning, one could certainly even call it visionary, and it has had its share of successes. But for those of us who believe more in the vibrancy, adaptability, and success of private enterprise, things are not quite as enthusiastic. Uptown Circle, formerly The Hole, couldn't find anybody to build there with private money unless we gave away the land and then subsidized it for to the tune of millions of dollars. Trail East is in a similar boat. We are collecting no rent for the art exhibits under the parking deck. And now we're looking to give away sales tax money for another enterprise. Back of the napkin numbers show that we won't see any sales tax from this business for about 5 years. If the council believes that Uptown is such a failure that we won't be able to get anybody in there for the next 5 years, and the only way to do that is to bribe them, by all means vote yes. Otherwise, we should stop giving taxpayer monies away to pick the winners and the losers and just let private businesses do what they do best and find the best solutions. Thank you.
And our final speaker is Terry Morgan.
Okay, thank you. Tonight I'll try to focus on another aspect of my career. The first time that I introduced myself to the council, I wanted to highlight my experience as it would relate to the Connect Transit issue. And tonight, I want to reflect on my accounting degree from Illinois Wesleyan. I became a certified public accountant and a licensed real estate broker in the state of Colorado, and kind of micromanaged my career, but primarily I focused on the area of real estate development, both commercial and residential. And so, because we are limited on time, I would like to make some comments as to my initial kind of like gut feeling about a TIF rebate. And to the best of what I understand, the certain facts regarding this particular instance, I would try to basically describe it as a double negative outlay of the taxpayers and or the consumers' dollars, as if it's a rebate of the sales taxes on the items that they purchase from the business, that's money coming out of their pockets. Then if the council goes ahead and approves a rebate from the revenues received from those tax dollars, it reduces the amount of funds that would be available to pay municipal expenses. And so the bottom line is I would really like to suggest not approving a rebate of the tax dollars. Now, I always like to say, I'd offer my consulting pro bono to whoever the investors, as I worked on looking at the pro forma financial statements for the projected revenues and the success of whatever was being proposed as development. And I'd probably like to recommend, maybe some additional income producing ideas, so that if the developers, the two partners of DPDO, were to not have this tax rebate factored into their numbers for the next 5 to 10 years, that it would be a wash and they would still be successful. I think it's great that their excitement and passion and their willingness to expand their business is an energy that I would not try to decrease or dissuade them in any way. But to offer a TIF rebate, I don't think would be a very good solution. So I may be out of time, so I won't necessarily go into two of the other points that I'd like to make, but.
And you are out of time, yes. That concludes our public comment for the evening. Normally, we would go to the Omnibus Agenda, and I'm going to ask, because there are many people here tonight and we've got a lot of ground to cover, I would ask for a motion to table item 5, which is the Omnibus Agenda, which would be items A through I. I would like to table those until we conclude the general orders and the new business, and then we'll take up the Omnibus Agenda. Motion?
I would gladly make a motion to table item 5. As
I
Mr.
need a
Day knows,
second.
I've always wanted to table something, so this is my big moment.
Second.
Will we still be given the opportunity to remove items from the omnibus?
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, we'll
Yes.
just change it. Yeah.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. As this is a motion to table, there is no discussion, and please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith? Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The motion is tabled. The Omnibus Agenda is tabled until we conclude the business of general orders and new business. Also, concerns and adjournment, obviously, will come after the Omnibus Agenda. So our first item for Omnibus is the presentation by Jamie Wilkie, partner at Lauterbach and Amen CPA firm. Amen or amen, I guess it can go either way, just like in church. CPA firm on the town's annual financial statements and audit report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Motion for approval?
No, it's a presentation.
Oh, it's just a presentation, you're right.
Thank you. Good evening. I do briefly this evening just want to cover some of the key highlights for the town's annual audit.
I know there was a memo packet that was included in the document, which I'd like to point out really did a nice job in 3 pages, trying to take a very large document and whittle that down into some layman's terms discussions of some of the key highlights for the year. So I'd first of all like to thank the staff involved. I know earlier this evening there was recognition of the finance team, but I do want to reiterate really the highest standard of excellence that we come into in engaging in the annual audit process with the team here. I want to personally thank Andrew, I know Sue, Karen, some others in the audience here. Our firm audits about 65 municipal entities on an annual basis, a handful of those being of similar size to the town here. To tell you that they do an outstanding job is really an understatement. As part of our annual testing, we are here off and on through about a 6-month process. We start with the planning phase of the audit, going into preliminary testing, fieldwork testing, the draft stage, as well as the issuance of the final documents. That 6-month process is quite a bit of coordinated effort back and forth between our audit team and the staff here internally. When we get through with our final fieldwork testing, I'm happy to report that we have really only found a few very minor adjusting journal entries. For a community of this size, that is quite unusual. Typically, when we come in to do the annual audit, there are some nuances that have to be reported on an annual basis that we as the auditors typically assist in those adjusting journal entries. The staff here does an excellent job of keeping up with technical standards, reporting requirements, and so as we come in, they've already, in theory, taken care of those adjustments. So I do want to thank them. It is really a outstanding audit package that is prepared for our firm on an annual basis. That is also outlined in the independent auditor's opinion. You'll find that on pages 10 through 12 of the document if you have that in front of you. Being that we had no findings, no significant adjusting journal entries, we have issued what we call an unmodified opinion. That is the highest level opinion that we can issue to any government entity. As part of that audit opinion process, we really are required to provide 2 pieces of information in that opinion. One, we are required to state that under that unmodified opinion, the financial statements as presented are materially correct. And 2, as part of that process, we are required to do an internal control assessment. So overall review of the internal control environment. Certainly this evening, if we had findings or issues with our testing, we would have to bring that forth to council in the form of formal communication. I'm happy to report we have no such findings, so really an outstanding clean audit process this year. I know it was mentioned earlier, but I did want to point out on page 9 of the document, the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting. Just a reminder, that is another independent third-party review of the annual audit document. There is about an 1.5 inch thick checklist that the town staff here must go through to make sure that the financial statements as presented meet that high-level criteria. And that is truly the highest level reporting we can have for any unit of government. The goal, as was stated earlier this evening, is really transparency of the annual CAFR. There are quite a few statements that are prepared internally to make sure that it meets those strict criteria. Most of those, I just want to point out, are provided starting on page 170 of the document in the form of what we call the statistical section. So quite a bit of historical information that can be found in that last section of the document itself. I would certainly be happy to address any specific questions that the council might have, but quite frankly, it was a very clean audit process and really nothing to have to report this evening to the council. Yes?
Questions?
Yes.
Ms. Smith?
From one accountant to another. How long has your firm been conducting the audit for the town of Normal?
The last several years.
And do you have an engagement that will extend into the future that you're aware of?
Potentially, yes. I mean, every engagement we do kind of function under an annual, city staff here and management has to be sure that they're comfortable with the services provided.
And is there a process in place to rotate the partner, the managing partner, out of this engagement to provide some fresh eyes?
We certainly can. So we've done that in a number of our other communities, that we've gone beyond that initial contract phase, if you will. We have about 155 employees firm-wide, including 2 other partners outside of myself that have specific municipal government audit expertise.
And you stated that you assess the internal control.
Correct.
My understanding is that for public reporting companies, they are required, auditing firms are required to actually audit the internal control. Could you explain the
Correct.
distinction of your process for this governmental audit?
Sure. So governmental audits are not required to actually have an opinion given on the actual internal control environment. What we are required to do as part of that, as I had stated, is really an overall assessment of the internal control environment. So we do go through detailed testing of controls. I do want to say that. We do engage in third-party confirmation for many of the material balances that are provided within the financial statements. So internal controls are certainly not ignored. We're simply not required to put a full scope opinion on the internal control environment.
Your report also indicates that there's no audit of the statistics. Have you ever done an audit of statistics for other communities, and what is gained when you do that in those engagements?
We have never done that because it's not required under government auditing standards. So the statistical section is truly provided as a form of additional information to users of the financial statements. We are required to review that information and make sure, kind of relative to the financial statements as a whole, that those kind of jive with what we're seeing in the financial statement audit.
And I'm referencing this report.
Yes.
On page 53, it states that the town council by majority vote may amend the legally adopted budget when unexpected modifications are required. Where did you find that authority? What document or what provision of town government grants that ability to amend a legally adopted budget? Do you recall?
Within the statutory requirements under the budget ordinance.
And then on page 79 of this document as well, if I can flip to that, it details the lease payments for One Uptown Normal from 2020 to 2032, totaling $4,845,119. And I believe there's some terminology in your notes that there are 3 renewal options beginning 11/27/2017 to 12/31/2032. Do you recall what the options are under that renewal? Would we actually be able to reduce the lease terms within that 2032 period or extend it beyond 2032?
I would certainly have to go back to the document. I don't recall that off the top of my head unless staff has input on that topic.
And then you did make a note that the funding for the dental and health insurance was not up to the recommended provision of 25%.
Yeah.
As I calculated it, it was 14%, and it's now 12.9%, and it's in the neighborhood of over 800,000 in both years. So what is your take on the town not satisfying that funding level?
From an audit perspective, because I have to put on my auditor hat, I can't make management recommendations. So certainly that is a finding based on the policy internally that's been put into place. But as far as a recommendation moving forward, that's not really my privy to be able to give those management recommendations.
And that funding level is recommended because the town
Internal
self-funds.
policy, correct. And that's an internal policy that's generated, correct.
And just for the record, I also see on page 80 that Connect Transit support is stated at $876,510 in the last fiscal year. And I wanted to make that part of the public record because the working group had a question about how much support Connect Transit receives. But in your notes, you say any deficits to be made up by Normal and Bloomington according to formula provided. So as you're reading the town documents, if Connect Transit has operating deficits, both Normal and Bloomington are obligated to subsidize any shortfalls that those systems may generate?
I would have to go back to the legal documents. I don't recall that off the top of my head.
Those were the questions I had.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions? Mr. Nord?
My microphone turned off. Thank you for the report. My question is just for understanding. So the report that you did and the evaluation, this was to show that the numbers are being presented accurately.
Correct.
It was not a report to say that how the money is being spent one way or the other. Is that correct?
Correct. That is not a scope within a financial statement audit.
Okay, thank you.
Further on this, on the presentation? Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity this evening.
Thank you.
Item 8 is a resolution to accept the audited report for the Town of Normal financial statements and report on internal controls for the town's auditors, Lauterbach Amann CPA firm for the year ending in March 31st, 2019.
Move approval. Second.
Is there discussion on this item? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. We have 3 items of new business tonight. The first is an ordinance authorizing the execution of a real estate contract for the purchase of Lot 2 of the Ohlendorf subdivision in the amount of $39,000, from McLean County Land Trust number 202, care of William Ohlendorf, and authorizing an associated budget adjustment.
Approval.
Thank you.
Second.
Second. Thank you. Discussion on this item. Mr. Nord?
I have a question about how the town has come up with the policy to determine or what policy was used to determine the purchase price of this land? Was there an appraisal, or how did that come about?
Sure. I will invite City Engineer Ryan Otto to come forward and talk a little bit about this project. In short, there was not an appraisal conducted in this particular instance. Oftentimes, we do go through an appraisal process. This particular parcel came to our attention when the developer contacted us about developing the site, and we discovered that there was no easement for the sewer that currently exists. So discussions then ensued. So I will turn it over to Mr. Otto.
Yes, the developer came to us looking to redevelop the parcel. The parcel was originally 4 different pieces that he had put together. It was discovered as we looked through it, looked at our utilities, what utilities were available to the site. Of course, there was sewer, water, everything was available. The buildings have been raised. It was currently, I believe, 3 homes were on this parcel originally. Those have been torn down. With the recent re-subdivision, they've created 2 lots, one of which is intended for redevelopment, and the other lot is basically in the area of the Vernon Avenue culvert. So the parcel itself is fairly small. I think it's 0.18 acres. It's advantageous to the town to own that, one, because it's part of the floodway. We did a project a couple of years ago prior to my coming to the town, but we redeveloped or regraded a lot of that area. We had to get permission from the landowner to go on that. The sewer will eventually be adjacent to that, and it's advantageous to own it, so we have access to the sewer as well in addition to the easement. So several different advantages to the town to be able to do that without having more right-of-way acquisition costs in the future for the Vernon Avenue culvert. We'd have to go back, presumably, to the owner at the time. Am I answering your question? I apologize. I feel like
you are.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question, if you may. So it sounds like this easement, the sewer was put in and there was no easement obtained way back when. So that's assumed a town error that we didn't get an easement before we put it in. Is that how that happened, or how did that come about?
Best I can tell, the sewer was likely put in around 1912. That was when the area was platted. I don't know exactly what happened. Something got missed. I've run across that occasionally in this community where there's an easement or a sewer through an area with no easement. And it's just one of those things that got discovered recently.
Sure. In the past, I mean, the town has gotten easements from other folks in the past when something's been discovered during the redevelopment phase. I'm just wondering what the decision was to buy the property versus just ask for all these other easements because you know you're going to need a partial easement for the culvert. Why we don't just get the easement to let the development go forward, because as we've been told, when the town acquires property, before the town acquires property, that property is being taxed. It's generating a revenue for the tax base. And when the town acquires that, then it's no longer generating any tax revenue. And so the other property owners then will have to pick up that deficit. And along Sugar Creek, aren't there other properties that the town does not own that we do the same maintenance and everything on too?
Mm-hmm. That's true. Good question. I think the thing that makes this parcel unique, it is in the floodway. The uniqueness is its proximity to the Vernon Avenue culvert and our need to get in and out of there frequently for maintenance for that whole stretch. It completes a stretch of the town-owned area coming down from Anderson Park all the way to Vernon. It's the only piece the town does not own. So it can be cumbersome if we need to get in there, but also owning the parcel, it gives us an advantage in the future design. We've not designed that culvert yet. I think it's in year 5 in the current capital budget, but that could give us the opportunity to do some realignment to improve hydraulic capacity and maybe save some bank stabilization costs and things like that when the culvert is improved.
Okay, then just as far as the purchase price, the $39,000 for the 0.1 acres, I think you said, of floodplain, that's basically not buildable. You know, as a council person, I don't know if that's a fair price to be asking for or a fair price to be paying. So without a policy, you know, we don't have an appraisal. We don't know if we're overpaying or underpaying. And that's my concern.
Excuse me, Mayor, if I could add one other comment in terms of if council authorizes this acquisition as part of that $39,000 purchase price, the developer is responsible then for the sanitary sewer design, relocation, and planning costs, which those costs could be significant. And this part of this project is relocating the sanitary sewer. So, Mr. Otto, is that accurate?
That's correct, yes.
Mr. McCarthy?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a comment?
No, I was,
Thank you.
from the materials I read, was going to comment. So washes out our cost of the property because the developer is taking on the cost of sewer that we would normally encumber. So essentially, it's netting out our expenses.
Further on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. Nord?
No.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The ordinance is approved. Item 10 is a resolution authorizing the execution of a project development agreement with the Fiala Brothers Beer LLC. Motion for approval?
So moved.
Second. Thank you. Before we get into it, there were 2 comments made, one in relation to this. I'll actually skip one, but I do take personal offense, Mr. Sela, that you refer to our actions as a bribe. That's pretty strong language, and I just want to go on the record saying I'm taking offense with that. There's not a presentation with this or anything, is there?
No, there's not. I believe the council report was pretty comprehensive, but if council has any questions, staff is prepared to answer those questions. In addition, the developer is present if there are specific questions associated with the development team. So we are here to answer your questions.
So, question, Ms. Smith.
Is the developer aware that the Trail East project will be placing a 5-story structure that may impair the view that they're seeking to have from this new rooftop dining experience?
Yes, they are aware of the pending Trail East project. And Ms. Smith, I thank you for highlighting that. I didn't specify, but as part of the Fiala Brothers plan is to take the current one-story structure, which was formerly occupied by Bill's Key and Lock, and convert that to a two-story structure, with the second story being fully accessible with an elevator and use by the public on the second story.
In the documents with the staff materials, it stipulates that free parking spaces are behind the building provided by the town of Normal. Is it customary for the town of Normal to furnish parking spaces to all the businesses in Uptown at no additional cost to them?
I wouldn't say it's customary for all the businesses. We have a number of redevelopment agreements in the Uptown area that have addressed parking as part of the development agreement. So, for example, Beaufort Partners, Uptown North, I think the CVS building, I can't remember what that building is called, but a number of those redevelopment agreements, including the Trail East agreement, address parking access.
And the taxes that we're proposing to rebate, if I'm reading from the audit report, it mentions a 2% sales tax, a 1% local tax, and then a separate beverage tax. So combined, is that 5.5% that we're rebating, or only 2.5% or 3.5%?
I'm gonna ask Eric or Mr. Hanson or Mr. Hune to clarify. The food and beverage component is 2%. So 3% total. 2%, so 1% local sales and 2% food and beverage.
So if I'm doing my calculations correctly and dividing that into the 150,000, then it would be necessary for them to generate revenues in the neighborhood of over 5 million to qualify for the $150,000 sales rebate. Is that correct?
Correct.
So
Over a period of time, right. And what we're proposing is a rebate up to a maximum of 150,000.
And as the young woman reported in her comment, that what we're asking patrons to do is pay a sales tax. So it's an additional expenditure to any patron of this establishment, but yet those dollars that for every other business in this locale, those dollars then go to support our municipality. We are not instead diverting those. Instead, we're allowing this business that is now generating in the neighborhood of $5 million in sales to keep those proceeds to offset their expenses. And in the audit report, it points out that we've increased local sales tax from 1.25 to 1.5% in 2010 to 2011, and from 1.5% to 2.5% in 2015 to 2016. So as I'm looking at this, TIFs, to my knowledge, were intended to address blighted areas. I would stipulate that I fail to see where Uptown Normal would fall under the category of blighted at this stage of development to qualify for this. And as she indicated, that over a 5-year period, that surely we could find somebody else that might be interested in that space that was formerly occupied by Bill's Lock and Key.
Well, if I may, I'm going to jump in on that and say that this is not a TIP project. This is a redevelopment agreement with the Fiala brothers, and the reason that they're doing it where they are is because they own the building adjacent, and it makes sense for them to do it in that building specifically.
If it makes business sense for them to do it, it should make business sense without town subsidy.
Right. And I understand what you're saying, Ms. Smith. I think the underlying assumption associated with our redevelopment projects is that the developer is planning to invest $1.5 million or $1.6 million, and in order to close that gap, this $150,000 is what will close the gap. Without this, then the buildings could potentially stay a one-story building and wouldn't then have the same opportunity to generate the kind of sales tax revenue that we're talking about with the two-story kind of building. So it's.
But we already have vacant space in one Uptown Normal that was supposed to be for retail and for a restaurant that was going to generate sales tax revenue. And now we're proposing to provide for a rebate to a new establishment on the premise that it would be recouped in sales tax revenue. And we haven't seen that promise fulfilled in One Uptown.
That is accurate. Ms. Lorenz.
There was something stated here just a moment ago that I'd like to clarify, and that is that the TIF district for Uptown, of course, I think we have about 5 TIF districts throughout the whole community. This just is one of them. Was put into place along about the early 2000s. Looking for Ms. Gaines was that about right? And so a TIF is something that runs for 23 years. So to say that it doesn't look blighted today is a true statement. However, 23 years ago, and many referred to this, the 1997 point, it did meet that criteria. So I don't think it's a fair statement to say because it doesn't look like it did in some 20 years ago, or just shy of that, that we need to stop the TIF. The TIF has about 6 or 7 years left. It's here, and it's in place, and it's an economic tool, and I think, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that it has been accomplishing, and it's got a little bit more life yet to accomplish. And the point of a TIF is to maximize the EAV of the area. And so I think some of those particulars are important for us to remember as we go through this discussion tonight.
Ms. Cummings.
Thank you, Mayor. A couple of things that I know I wanted to clarify that were kind of not clear. Number one, that this is not a TIF. Number two, that I want to make sure I was reading with comprehension, because maybe I've lost that ability. But my understanding is they only get the rebate based on performance. And so that means if no performance, no money. Checking on, am I still educationally sound?
That's an accurate statement, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Reese. So with that being stated, it's really not much for us to make this investment. We are not giving away a check. We're not giving away money. This is dollars that are currently not being produced at this time. In a long run, based off of their numbers that they reported, which in a business plan you have to provide, which are oftentimes, before we make those decisions, reviewed soundly. And it also said conservatively, meaning we're looking at from a very healthy position instead of going more liberal financially, to say, okay, based off of these numbers, this is how we came up with this figure. Granted that there could be where they've made more that will allow for them to give to the town aside from that, correct? Correct. So after they meet that threshold of $150,000. And most of our incentives we've done so far, and I believe you can quote me and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe in the Portillo situation, they actually met before the anticipated time, correct, for the goals for that project?
That was a little bit different. Okay.
Just wanting to understand, it shows that some of the businesses can actually meet before time. We are very optimistic on what is being done. I think also a little bit, to use the second floor, possibly a blocked view. I'm not in agreement with that, because I think there's a blocked view from the hotel, which I've gone to some awesome events on their roof, or their semi-rooftop on their second floor. So I think that there's still opportunities for people to have good scenery, good vibes on a rooftop. I just am excited to continue. Interestingly enough, during the sweet corn circus, people stopped to share their stories of why they loved the town of Normal, and the majority of the responses were Uptown. There were some people who lived out of town, and they mentioned when they come to see family, this is their place to go. And I think to have the opportunity just to assist one other business to be able to grow and expand locally, who has a very interesting story locally of how they've grown locally. I'm excited about that, and I'll talk a little bit later about my expertise and knowledge on economic development, so I'll yield the rest of my time.
Mr. Preston.
Thank you, Mayor. Two questions for staff. The first one, in the council packet, it many times represents that the projected total project cost will be in the $1.6 million range, and then in the actual development agreement itself, item 12.4, Fiala represents and warns that it will invest at least $1.35 million for the redevelopment. Just wanting some clarification as to if there's any, science behind the at least 1.35 million figure, or if that is typically, I believe it's about between 85 and 90% of the 1.6 figure, if that's typically what is considered.
Ms. Reese, I can answer that if you'd like.
Yes, I was going to defer to Mr. Hanson.
Sure. Yeah, the difference is that's the development number, the construction number, add the 275 purchase price, and you get the 1.6 number total for the project. So the 1.6 includes the total project cost, which includes property acquisition. Then they anticipate, based on the data that they provide us, another 1.3-ish in actual construction costs, which includes the addition of the second floor, an elevator, an accessible elevator, which is a substantial undertaking. And one would expect, based on the state of that property, would substantially alter the assessed value of that property for the next several decades for the town related to the development, which is one of the considerations that we took when we looked at this project, when we assessed this project when they came to us.
Good, that makes a lot of sense. And then my second question, the packet says that the agreement, the development agreement is not transferable. And then in the development agreement, 5.6, that talks about assignment of rebate, unless I'm misunderstanding or misinterpreting this, which is entirely possible. It sounds like it could be transferable in theory if both parties, the Fiala brothers, as well as presumably the town of Normal, would agree to such a thing down the road. Is that an accurate interpretation of 5.6?
Yeah, under this, there's for permitted assigns, so they can assign it with our permission. So if they're selling it to somebody else, then they could do it, but they couldn't do it without town permission first. And we've done this before. We've had matters come into council for assignments of contracts.
And any assignment would require council action?
Yes. And yes, and in this case, we've written it just to make sure that in the event that ever does happen, that there's no conflict as to who's supposed to get a payment, is the purpose of that provision.
Mr. McCarthy, and then Mr. Nord.
Well, I don't know if anybody's said it yet, but I'm excited about this project. If you're like me and you like craft beer is big business in the United States, and it's growing. It brings money in from all over the county, from all over the state, from our neighboring states. I don't know, he came here to be recognized, but we have a local expert on the subject, Mr. Potts here of DeSille Brewing, who can verify the economic development value of craft beer and bringing money from outside our community into our community, which is the definition of great economic development. Bring money into your community from outside your community, not just move it around. So I'm very excited about this project. I want to clear something away. I've got a question about this over the weekend, and now the word TIF was just mentioned. I just want to be clear, this is not a TIF project. Friends in the media, this is not a TIF project. No funds are being, TIF funds are being used for this project. This is, thank you. This is not a TIF project. Let's not confuse the issue. So what we have here is some business owners that are willing to invest up to $1.6 million of their own money, take a risk, and our Uptown hopefully do very, very well. Hopefully generate that $5 million in less than 10 years. I'd like to see you guys do it in 1 or 2 and be wildly successful and be up here talking about a different conversation, and I'll be there. But in return, they're asking us to share a little bit of what they generate from their business. And so what we've heard already, one of my council counterparts essentially said, no success, no revenue, no rebate. And so this whole deal is structured on them. All the risk is on the owners. Good luck, gentlemen. However this turns out tonight, but very little risk for us. This is not on existing revenues. That's one of the questions I got over the weekend. This is only on the new revenue that this business would theoretically generate once they're open, invested their own money, and then start to do business. Is there any type of incentive potentially being offered? Now, we've been focusing on sales tax and food and beverage tax. So that's 2 things that we've already heard that this business is potentially going to generate. What we haven't talked about is jobs, because they're growing a business and growing jobs. So that's also what's going to be generating off this project is people are going to earn livings working in a business. So it's economic development at its finest, money from outside, jobs on the inside. Also, because this is in a TIF, it's increased property value, and that helps us inside this TIF increase the EAV, which at the end helps our friends at Unit 5 and all around the community get more tax dollars to help our kids in schools. This is a win-win-win project. Very, very low risk for the taxpayers because it's all on the business owners. I'm fully supportive and wish them the best.
Mr. Nord.
This has been stated several times. This is not a TIF incentive. This is an economic development incentive. A couple of questions that I would have is there a formal policy that gives us the criteria that we would use this economic development incentive elsewhere in the community? If this restaurant or if another restaurant or bar comes and wants to spend the same amount of money but somewhere else, not in Uptown, would we offer this incentive? You know, that's a question that I would ask yourself, because this is an economic development incentive. We've got the Economic Development Council that we pay lots of money every month to advise us on economic development incentive and on economic development incentives. And to my knowledge, they've not been included in this conversation. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. As I explained in an earlier conversation, Mr. Nord, Mr. Hoban just started his job 4 weeks ago. And so he has hit the ground running and is doing a lot in terms of getting to know the community and such, but staff has been in conversations with the Fiala Brothers development team for a while. And, we're not new to this sort of agreement. So we were confident in moving forward and presenting this development agreement to council. In regard to your question about could this happen elsewhere in the community, yes. If staff believed it was worth the kind of project to bring it to council's attention, and if we believed that it was the right project and with the right economic development impact, certainly we would bring it to council for consideration.
In fact, I would add to that, we have done exactly that. The Portillo's arrangement was that kind of deal. Shops at College Hills was that kind of deal. We could go on and on. We have done economic incentives throughout the community in commercial development.
Sure. If the council is going to be making all the economic development decisions, then maybe we should consider not giving the Economic Development Council the money to be helping us with that. But that's for a different conversation. To get back on track here, have we done any analysis to identify what the net economic benefit is to the community for this? Because in restaurant, and I spoke with the Fiala Brothers before, their restaurant is geared more towards local consumers. They're not creating beers to then be sold throughout the country to bring new money in. It's predominantly going to be a restaurant bar for the local consumers. So If there's no new people coming in, those people that are going out to currently eat right now, they're eating somewhere else in the community. So when they open, we're not increasing the size of the market. All we're doing is just redistributing market share. So the people that would have gone out to eat elsewhere are going to choose to go there, and I truly hope that they are successful. But since the taxpayers are investing in this, what is the net gain? Has that analysis been done?
Staff has done an analysis looking at the pro forma and all the general assumptions we make with development projects and redevelopment agreements. I'll ask Mr. Hanson and potentially Mr. Hune their opinion on that.
Sure. I think one of the things that we look at constantly that's been a struggle on the retail side is there's been obviously a movement to buy things online. But you don't buy food online typically unless you go through DoorDash. If you look at the 10-year history of the town and the food and beverage tax, it's grown over 45% townwide. It's grown every single year for the last 10 years, some years better than others, even through the recessionary period. What used to be roughly, and I don't want to steal Mr. Hune's thunder because you're going to get trends analysis next week, next meeting, but on this one I'll jump in, so I'll apologize now, Andrew. Food and beverage tax revenue for the town has grown from 1.9 million to a projected 2.7 million next year just on food and beverage. The average increase is, well, do the quick math, it's almost 5% annually. That is the one advantage that food and beverage industries have. You look at the totality of the activity going on in the town, and obviously we're not building as many houses, so where would this money come from? One, it's a stronger economy, obviously, but two, we host an enormous amount of people in the town throughout the year. We've added 342 hotel rooms in our Uptown. I suspect that Mr. Fiala would be misguided if he didn't market to those visitors, and I expect that he expects them to buy his products. As we look at this from a staff perspective, there are a number of activities that go on throughout the year in which we welcome people into our community with which to generate revenue in this arena. And it's the one advantage that we have as a center that draws people in that online sales cannot compete with. And if you look at the food and beverage tax increases juxtaposed to the sales tax overall increases, and they're much smaller because we are losing market share to online sales. We are losing market share to online sales just like every other community in the country. But the one thing that we can do and the one thing that they're playing to, and I suspect that Mr. Potts would tell you the same thing, as well as any of a number of our restaurateurs and businesses come and go. And the town, just like every other community experiences that. But when you look at the data in its totality, our overall activity in this area is growing, has grown, and has grown every single year for the last decade. And I would expect that as we continue to host events such as the softball tournaments, as the sporting tournaments, as ISU has welcomed a record number of freshmen who are all going to spend money in our economy, that trend will continue. If you juxtapose that to some of our communities that also host universities that have lost half their student bodies, I would suspect that you would see a much different profile in their revenue stream on these activities because they truly have fewer people coming to their communities, coming to their events, and the challenges are real in terms of the revenue depletion that they are experienced that the town of Normal has not.
Thank you. What I got from that was the business in the food and beverage area is going up, which means that likely that's going to mean that they're going to be getting more customers coming in as well. So business looks good for them. I didn't hear that there are new people coming into the community that will be eating. These are just people that are here. Well, they are not coming in just for this business. They're being brought in for all the businesses. So the ones that will choose to go here could have chosen to go anywhere else. So I just don't see the net gain for the taxpayers for this investment. Another piece is the parking that the town is providing In Uptown, parking is a scarcity, and that is an economic incentive if we're giving that away. So has there been an appraisal as to what parking is worth so we can include that in this economic incentive package?
Specifically in regard to parking, I would disagree that it's a scarcity. In fact, we have data on the additional number of spaces throughout this entire project. So I think in terms of the 3 spaces we're talking about behind the project, this is not, back to your question, we haven't done any kind of market study, or we have not put a specific dollar amount to the value of that on a per monthly basis. But staff has addressed this as we have other development agreements. So if council is not comfortable with 3 spaces associated with this project, then we can certainly address that with the developer, but this would be out of the ordinary from our typical development agreements. Specifically in regard to the number of spaces available, I know that Mr. Hansen has that information.
Yeah, so back at the formation of the TIF, the town did a parking study, obviously long before I was here. And there was roughly 1,200 spaces in Uptown. Currently today, there's just under 2,000 spaces available in Uptown, or about if my math is correct, about a 60% increase in the number of spaces that have been added to Uptown since the start of the TIF. I would argue, and many people can certainly offer varying opinions, but I suspect that the parking is more related to the demand than it is to the availability, because there have been, as I said, my math is correctly, a roughly 60% addition in terms of available parking in the Uptown. But certainly with the advent of all the business and the things that in the economic activity that are going on, there is more demand for those spaces, and I would argue that's a good thing. Empty parking lots don't do communities a lot of good.
No, I would agree with that. At the meeting that we had for Connect a couple weeks ago, the parking garage was full. For the Corn Fest, whenever we came for that, or the Corn Circus.
Mr. Nord, we covered that in the last meeting, and that was due to ISU move-in.
But also, when Trail East goes up, we're giving, I believe the number was 250 reserved
Well, we're not here to
parking
talk about
places.
Trail East tonight, sir.
And that will then eat into the parking as well. I've heard that the Uptown is such a success. Well, if it's such a success, taxpayers should not have to continue subsidizing and giving things away for businesses to come into Uptown. And that concerns me. With Portillo's, there was a loud outcry from the community about the incentives that we gave for Portillo's. And this is another restaurant, and we're doing something very similar. That is concerning. As far as the prevailing wage piece, I do agree that if there is going to be government funding, that should be something that is required. But as I guess we've discussed before, or has been brought up, because the town requests prevailing wage does not mean that the developer actually follows through. Do we have any better enforcement to ensure that that's going to happen if this does get passed?
Well, I will defer to Mr. Day to explain that, but in regard to the agreement and the development agreement, we indicate that that is the developer's obligation to make sure prevailing wages are paid if they apply, because it's up to them and their contractor. It depends on who they're using as a contractor. I'll defer to Mr. Day for additional information.
Right. So the prevailing wages are required under state statute, the Prevailing Wage Act, which sets out certain criteria for when prevailing wages are required in a project. It has been the past interpretations that sales tax rebate agreements do not trigger prevailing wage requirements.
But Mr. Day, that wasn't our interpretation. That was a state interpretation.
That was a state Illinois Department of Labor interpretation. Our duty under that statute, just to protect our interest, is to say, if the Prevailing Wage Act applies, you are required to comply with it. And we have to put the website information where they can find the Prevailing Wage Act.
That is to protect the municipality so that if there is an issue, nobody can sue the municipality for the differential in prevailing wages. So that's why the provision is in this contract. We're not requiring that they have to pay prevailing wage. What we're saying is they have to follow the state statutes, whatever that determination is. They've got to go to Department of Labor to determine whether prevailing wage applies under this context. In terms of enforcement, those are generally handled through the Department of Labor. The Illinois Department of Labor has a whole complaint system set up for prevailing wage issues. Because the state has in the past been, let's say, very whimsical in their interpretation of when prevailing wage does or doesn't apply, the town generally will stay out of making prevailing wage determinations, mostly because we don't have authority to under the statute. That's a Department of Labor jurisdiction. So we wouldn't come in and say, you're supposed to be paying it here, but you're not. If there's an issue where the Department of Labor makes a determination, then we can move under the default provisions under the contract, but we wouldn't be looking to make our own prevailing wage determinations.
Okay, so they don't have to, is what I got from that. Another question then was,
I don't think that's what was just stated.
Well,
they're going to step in here. That's not what the city attorney, that they don't have to. Is what he's saying is the jurisdiction is under the control of the Illinois Department of Labor, not the town of Normal, and that we're going to direct them to follow the statute, not that they don't have to follow the statute.
That's correct. Yeah, it's the Department of Labor's determination. If the Department of Labor says they have to, then they have to.
I thought you said that if this was food and beverage or the sales tax, that then they don't have to follow it,
That has been traditionally the interpretation. One thing, and we've got a new administration now, and interpretations tend to change. So, again, it's incumbent upon them to go to the Department of Labor to get that determination.
Okay, but that's up to them. That's not up to this council.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. Was any community outreach done to the existing food and beverage establishments in the area who will be competing for the exact same customers to see if this was something that they were in favor of? Because they will be subsidizing their competition.
No.
Okay. My recommendation is that the town, the government, should not be involved in business decisions. If a business decides to build or do something, they need to make their own evaluations on if it's profitable to build to one scale or a different scale, or to do whatever they want to do. That is their decision. We should only get involved if it's going to be bringing new economic activity, new money from outside the area, new jobs, new good jobs, higher paying jobs, and that is what we should be involved in.
And that, sir, I would agree with you as a matter of interpretation. There are people that agree with you, and there are people that don't agree with you. And I think we're going to end discussion on this. I know how this is going to move forward. I'm pretty clear on the vote. If you have something new to add, but it's clear we've taken this to a point of...
Well, I just wanted to point out that the implication that this was a TIF money is in the discussion analysis. It begins with the proposed project is within the Uptown TIF. And so by the halo effect,
it is located within the TIF district, correct?
Yes.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Smith?
No.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
No.
Mayor Kus?
Yes, the resolution is approved. Item 11 is a presentation by PGAV concerning the Uptown Renewal Project and Uptown Tax Increment Financing District.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Mr. Weber to come forward. He has quite a robust presentation to share with council. Mr. Weber is with PGAV and will be introducing some information about what is the TIF, the Uptown Renewal, background information, the impact of the Uptown TIF. The timing of this presentation is linked to the fact that September, as you now know, is a busy month for us to look at the town's financial situation, obviously with the report from Lauterbach and Amen tonight, and next meeting will be the annual financial trends report from Andrew Hune and the finance team. We are soon going to be having our annual joint review board meeting for all the TIFs, which is an annual meeting. And of course, we've got 2 new council members, and we're getting ready to get into our budget process. So the time seemed appropriate to focus on the Uptown as and its economic impact, as well as a review of the Uptown TIF as the economic development tool that was chosen to support the Uptown Renewal project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Weber.
Good evening, Mayor and members of the council. Again, my name's Mike Weber. I've been in the field of economic development and urban planning for over 40 years, and I've been with the firm of PGAV for 24 years. A lot of my experience has occurred in the state of Illinois, particularly with regards to economic development. I serve on the executive committee of the Illinois Tax Increment Association. I'm also appointed to the Illinois Comptroller's Local Government Advisory Board. Before I get into the specifics of our analysis, I'd just like to overall provide some background on TIF. It's a pretty simple concept when you look at it, but it's also a bit perplexing. And sometimes it can be somewhat counterintuitive when you look at it, because every economic development professional out there with any experience knows that having good schools and safe neighborhoods and so forth are the utmost foundation of good economic development policy. So why in the heck would you take money from a school district and put it into a redevelopment project? And so sometimes TIF gets a bad rap for doing that. Sometimes communities overuse TIF. Sometimes they can even abuse it. From my experience with over 150 different TIF programs throughout the state, I see less abuse versus incompetence in dealing with TIF. What I do see here in the town of Normal is a great level of professionalism and not incompetence. And also the Normal TIF is relatively complicated because of all the other layers of financing that go into the whole redevelopment revitalization scheme. So while TIF can get a bad rap, and the whole concept of diverting money that should go or could go to the taxing bodies into a dedicated fund for redevelopment purposes, it's just not quite that simple. And when we get into the analysis here, we can measure the kind of impacts that this TIF has under certain assumptions and key assumptions. By the way, can you all hear me okay? First slide here, many Illinois communities have successfully used TIF. I think that includes the town of Normal. However, the story gets lost over time. You only see snippets every now and then in the newspaper. Unsuccessful projects, i.e. the pit, or whatever you call that here, get amplified. The success stories that you had with your TIF gets forgotten, misunderstanding festers. The impact on taxing districts or the taxpayer is misunderstood, and I'm going to get into the details of that here so you hopefully have a better understanding of what those impacts are. But in order to measure those impacts, we have to go back to the original but-for test finding that this town council had to make when they set this TIF up in the first place. And I'm going to touch on that and harp on that as we go through this presentation. Downtown Normal wasn't unlike many other Midwestern older downtowns. It was distressed. It was looking pretty ragged. You had a lot of obsolete and vacant buildings, spaces. You did have an inventory of some pretty nice buildings that would be worthy of restoration, but the infrastructure stunk. I mean, I heard the Public Works Director talk about when a sewer was installed back in 1912. Down in Bloomington, I've seen sewers in the downtown area there that were built in the mid-1850s. So that can be a very big obstacle of revitalizing older downtowns. There's a few pictures of what things used to look like. This is a shot down, I think that's Beaufort, East Beaufort. Some of the older buildings that were around that aren't around anymore, including the old Rockies. That's where the Children's Discovery Museum site is. But back in 1999, the town council decided to do something about downtown. They hired FAR associates out of the Chicago area to help formulate a vision and a plan for the area. And they came up with a very robust and aggressive plan. But the question is how is the town and the private sector going to pay for its implementation? So the action taken back then, the town leadership was committed to making the plan a reality. The various sources of funding would have to be tapped, and this would include TIF as well as debt financing for public infrastructure. And the TIF district would generate a portion of the needed funds to help induce private investment as well as covering some of those infrastructure costs. And at the end of the day, the TIF would not work unless we got significant private investment. That's the key to a successful TIF. And as a result, obviously the Uptown TIF, and well, downtown, now Uptown, is experiencing a renaissance. Not everything has gone as planned, but the vision is really becoming a reality. And you heard that in some of the commentary earlier, but some of the facts behind that. The Uptown area has experienced construction, new building construction of nearly 595,000 square feet. That's a lot of new building space in the Uptown area, and that includes the Children's Discovery Museum as well as the space for 203 new residential units downtown, which residential units downtown bring 24-hour traffic, which is a great piece of a solution of a downtown area and a place of central public gathering. The city's also added, or the downtown has also added 342 hotel rooms. Many buildings have been renovated. This analysis came off the press at about 3 o'clock this afternoon. We were trying to get the data on how much investment has taken place in existing buildings, but we're unable to vet all that data out. So we know it's a lot. And then in addition to new buildings and building renovation, we've added, or towns that has added 700 public parking spaces. And one thing I might add as a side note here, based on some of the discussions tonight and our expertise in economic development and the kinds of things that kill deals, particularly in smaller markets such as this, is structured parking will kill a deal, and elevators in existing old buildings will kill the deal. When you run the numbers, it just doesn't make economic sense if the private sector has to pay $25,000 a space for a parking space. And if you're talking about the densities that were envisioned here, there's no other way to make that happen downtown without building some of these parking structures. Some before and afters. This is the Marriott Hotel and Conference Center site before. The old Watterson Place, I don't remember that, but these pictures indicate there's a lot of vacant space there. And then here's the photograph of the after. There were $67 million total in redevelopment project costs associated with the hotel and the conference center. Now let's get into some of the TIF basics. TIF is an economic development tool designed to achieve two principal goals. And one is to remove conditions of blight or conditions that may lead to blight, and then ultimately enhance the tax base of all affecting taxing bodies. When this TIF district was established, well, I'll touch on that later, but anyway, all taxing districts participate by foregoing or experiencing unrealized revenue that they would otherwise get if this development would take place absent TIF. But at the end of the day, at the end of the 23 years, hopefully they get the windfall of a larger tax base. And again, success is measured by the amount of private investment, which results in increased property values. Three fundamental findings have to be made when you set up a TIF district, and this was accomplished back in 2003 when the TIF plan was adopted. First, the area has to qualify as a blighted area, a conservation area, or a combination of both, or an industrial park conservation area, which is a totally different animal that's used in certain situations. In this case, the Uptown Normal qualified as a conservation area, and basically what that meant is that more than half of the buildings in the area were over 35 years old, and by virtue of that, only 3 out of the 13 blighting factors spelled out in the TIF Act have to be present within the area, as opposed to a blighted area where you have to find 5 out of those 13 criteria. And Illinois has one of the most stringent and most comprehensive definitions of blight and conservation area throughout the United States. You also have to make a finding of lack of growth and development by private enterprise in recent history. And then I just saw a typo in here, but for TIF, not TIP, private investment will not occur. And all 3 of those findings are legal findings. They have to be made by the town council, and there's documentation of evidence to all of these factors in the original TIF plan, and the town council made those legal findings upon adopting that plan and establishing the TIF district. And so from this point forward, or that point forward, there's no need to make a finding of blight for every redevelopment project that you do in the TIF. It doesn't mean you can't take that into account when you're negotiating redevelopment agreements, but the town council made that finding back when they established the TIF. How TIF works, this is a hypothetical example. Basically, you establish the TIF area and the base equalized assessed value of that area, meeting the TIF Act requirements. In this case, boy, this PDF printed out weird. The numbers are 1111. Anyway, technical glitch here. So let's just say the initial base equalized assessed valuation in the TIF generated $50,000 in property taxes. And then after you do your redevelopment, it generates $300,000 in real property taxes. The tax increment is simply the difference. So you have $250,000 of tax increment that goes into a special tax allocation fund, as we illustrate here in this graphic. So, boy, this is printing out weird. Sorry about these technical glitches, but in any event, the blue shaded area at the bottom is the tax on the base EAV that was in the TIF district when it was originally established. And the districts continue to receive the tax on that base EAV during the life of the TIF. What you see in red is the revenue that goes to the special tax allocation fund that probably wouldn't have happened unless you did the TIF. But at the end of the life of the TIF in 23 years, the TIF base is now added to the increased TIF EAV, and now you have a much larger, or hopefully much larger tax base upon which taxing districts can base their levy request on. As I mentioned before, the TIF was established in 2003. There's been a lot of nice development activity, including the new circle, the multimodal transit, and public parking, the Children's Museum, which, by the way, just welcomed its 2 millionth visitor this summer. Looking east down Beaufort, the new Hyatt Place. So obviously, TIF has played a key role in revitalizing Uptown Normal. But some of the perceptions of TIF include, not just here, in other communities as well, that the taxing bodies are losing money because of TIF. And it says TIP again. There's something weird.
glitch in
it automatically changed it.
Font package.
I don't know, but my PDF doesn't show it that way. What is this?
I think this is a conversion to PowerPoint in order to make the presentation go.
Do you have PowerPoint? I have a thumb drive for PowerPoint.
The PDF is that you sent is.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's working. Thanks for your patience. Oh, what's going on here? We got to do a different display. Great.
Oh, there we go, that's better. Thank you, Mindy.
Thank you.
Thanks for saving my butt. I was really getting embarrassed. So, you know, there's a lot of obvious stuff that's happening. It's been good stuff. The ITIA has had several conferences here over the years, including last spring, or this spring. And I tell you, people from out of town are just flabbergasted. But you still have some common perceptions, and it's not just here. I see this elsewhere, that the taxing districts are losing money to TIF. The tax rates are higher because of TIF, and we'll get into those specifics. TIF's a failure. There's vacant space in new buildings, and there remains deteriorated and obsolete buildings in your TIF. But the counter arguments is 1 and 2 can only be valid if the redevelopment projects would have happened absent TIF. Also claims 1 and 2 must assume that the tax base outside the TIF did not offset some or all of the TIF EAV growth, and we're going to get into those specifics. And then claims 3 and 4 are basically pessimistic claims. It takes time to absorb all the space in new building construction. That's fairly typical. And likewise, dealing with problem properties can take a long time. And you're lucky that your Uptown is not terribly large, which a lot of other communities about your size have larger Uptowns, and it's a bigger problem. So Uptown by the numbers. This is a comparison of the equalized assessed valuation growth within the TIF district, both pre-TIF, 5 years before the TIF was established, and then afterwards. And what you see is that the Uptown area was basically just keeping pace with inflation for the 5 years prior to the year 2003 when the TIF was created, and then it shot up like a slingshot. That's exactly what we like to see in a TIF district. So the TIF district has increased by nearly 28 million or 202%. That's a good sign. The total private and public investment in the Uptown TIF, locally, both TIF and debt has tallied or will tally $90 million. That has leveraged $169 million in private investment, and it also helped us secure $37 million in state and federal grants. So basically what we've got here is $90 million of local investment, leveraging $206 million of private investment and grants in the TIF area. And by the way, this does include the Trail East project, for which we plugged in an estimate of $25 million. So one of the benefits of TIF is the spin-off revenue that has taken place with regards to the sales taxes that you folks were discussing earlier. The aggregate of that, the finance department went through all the sales tax data and did an analysis where they looked at the sales tax collections from 2002 through 2018. By the way, that shouldn't say fiscal year, those are calendar years. And what this is showing is that there's been a net increase, aggregate increase of $14.2 million of added sales tax revenue since the beginning of the TIF. And that's about a little over $1 million a year just out of the TIF program. So how does TIF affect the taxing districts and the taxpayers? First, let's cover some property tax basics so we have a basic understanding of how that works, and then we can talk about how TIF interrelates with that. So there's two main variables with regards to the property tax levy. In other words, how much a taxing district such as the town gets from its tax base, and that's how much the town asks for in its levy and how big is the tax base. And what that yields is the tax rate needed to be applied to that tax base to get that levy. So the hypothetical example here shows that the taxing district needs $1 million of property tax to operate, and their tax base is $20 million. So the tax rate would be 1 million divided by 20 million, and it gets you to a 5% tax rate, or $5 per $100 of equalized assessed value. That's how it's typically expressed here in Illinois. And one thing I wanted to make clear is the taxing districts do not set the tax rate. The tax rate is calculated by the county clerk based upon that levy request, calculated against the tax base. So if we change one variable such as the levy request, and starting from the left there, if the levy goes up and the tax base stays the same, the tax rate will go up. If we change the tax base variable, in other words, just let it, or excuse me, the tax base variable, the levy request stays the same, the tax base goes up. If those conditions exist, the tax rate will go down. If we change both variables and the levy and the tax base increase proportionately, so on the left, the levy goes up, the levy request, the tax base goes up proportionally, that enables the tax rate to stay about the same or the same. And it's this situation that the taxing districts like to see to be able to cover their increased cost of operations without having the tax rate go up. So secondly is the tax computations. So this is the upper left-hand corner of the official McLean County tax computation report for the town of Normal. And what I'd like to point out here is you have the total equalized assessed value, and a rate-setting EAV. Well, what's the difference here? Well, the total EAV includes the TIF increment EAV that you see circled over at the right, that $39 million. And so if you subtract the $39 million from the total EAV of $920 million, you get the $881, and that's the tax base by which the county clerk is going to use to calculate your tax rate. So when a taxing district, such as the township or the school district, gets their tax computation report and they see that $39 million, you think, wow, that's a lot of money, and we can't use that to calculate our tax levy. So, because the tax on that $39 million is going to the TIF fund and not to the taxing bodies. So that in and of itself right there just raises a big red flag. So now we go to the full TIF or tax computation report, and this is the normal example where on the upper left-hand side there you see rate-setting EAV number there, and then you see the various calculations down in the bottom. And basically, the town's adjusted levy, in this case, the town is abating its levy on bonds and interest. So the town is asking for a little over $9 million to operate, and this is the 2018 tax year. The county clerk goes through the various calculations and finally gets to a certified rate of 1.02714, which yields a little over $9 million. In this case, the town basically got what it asked for, okay? Now let's go to the school district. The school district has a rate-setting EAV of over $2.2 billion. If you look at the calculations down below, their adjusted levy request is $121 million. The next two columns, you see a lot of yellow highlights in there. The school district, unlike the town, has a lot of funds that have tax rate maximums assigned to them. So if the school district asks for a certain level of taxes, let's take the top line, the education fund, they're asking for $61.2 million, and the maximum rate is 2.72. When the clerk calculates it, it comes out to 2.74. Well, you can't go above 2.7. So they're going to get less than what they asked for in that fund. And when you add all this up together, what they get versus what they asked for is over $600,000 less than what they asked for. So that'll come into play when we start calculating the impact of TIF. They didn't get what they asked for now, and a lot of it has to do with the maximum rates that apply to a lot of their funds. So what would happen if the taxing districts didn't get what they asked for? So the question is, if that TIF EAV that we talked about before was converted to rate-setting EAV, perhaps the total levy request could have been achieved. And for each tax year, we can calculate that, and we did that. But in order to do this, and I say this not just here and before, but I'll say it again, you must assume that the TIF incremental EAV would have had been generated absent the TIF. And we think that assumption is unrealistic, but nonetheless, you can do the math to calculate the so-called impact. So in this table, we did just that, and I'm going to focus on two of the taxing districts here. We saw before that the Community Units District 5 came up short $622,000 on their levy request. If we look at the TIF EAV, the Uptown TIF EAV, and applied the district's tax rate to that, we get a calculated tax foregone to TIF of $1.5 million. But that's the calculated, because we're using the rate that was determined based upon their rate-setting EAV in the original equation. So the net unrealized revenue to TIF is the 622. Does that make sense? If we look at Heartland, they were short $187,000 on their levy request, but the calculated TIF or the calculated tax foregone to TIF was 167. So the net impact on them is the 167, not 187, because TIF wouldn't have made up the total difference. So if we do these calculations for all the taxing bodies, and we look at that impact for every year, tax year starting with 2003 through to tax year 2014, this table tells us how much unrealized tax revenues the taxing districts have experienced because of the TIF over those 16 or so years. In the case of the school district, that's 5.9, call it $6 million, and that's a big number. But if you look at their total actual levies during that same period, they levied close to $1.5 billion. So the amount of unrealized tax revenues compared to those actual levy collections represents 0.4 of 1 cent for every dollar that they levied. So in terms of impact, that's what the impact is on the school district. It's much less on other school districts. The Bloomington Normal Water Reclamation District is at the same level as the school district. But again, in order to do this analysis, you have to assume that all this development would have occurred absent TIF. So, as you saw before, it's a matter of relativity. This chart shows the rate-setting EAV for the town of Normal during the life of the TIF all the way up to 2018. It also shows the trend in EAV in the Uptown TIF. And you can see that the Uptown TIF percentage-wise increased a lot, but it's relatively small compared to their tax base that they actually get the tax. So the town tax base went up by 26 million. So in this case, the town's rate-setting EAV growth represented 91% of the EAV growth in the TIF district. We go to the school district, the variance is even greater. The school district's rate-setting EAV increased by over $800 million. Again, the TIF EAV increased close to 28. So in this case, the school district's rate-setting EAV represented 97% of the total EAV growth in the TIF district. But when we do these types of analysis, we also take a look at the trends in tax rates in the community, because we have seen instances where TIF EAV is causing upward pressure on the total tax rate. So we're going to take a look at that in the case of the Uptown TIF, because since the Uptown TIF has been in place, the tax rate has been rising gradually on an average 1.3% annually. So it stands to reason that not being able to tax the Uptown TIF incremental EAV is causing these tax rate increases. So would tax rates be lower if TIF EAV became rate-setting EAV? So this shows the tax rate trend. You can see the total rate for all taxing bodies combined went from 7.3 up to 8.9, close to 9%, or over those years from 2003 to 2018. The school district makes up a pretty good chunk of that, and the balance of that is all other taxing bodies. So how much could the tax rate have gone down if the Uptown TIF had ended in 2018, and we're now going to calculate the levies for the taxing districts in 2018? Again, we must assume that all the Uptown TIF private investment would have occurred absent TIF. We also have to assume that the taxing districts would keep their levy request the same as the 2018 request was. And other assumptions would be that the tax base growth elsewhere in the taxing district stays the same. And we also are going to assume in these calculations that the town will continue to abate taxes on bonds that are currently being partially paid for without Uptown TIF revenue. And again, I'll reiterate, assumption 1 is unrealistic, but nonetheless, we can run through the calculations. So here, this table for the town of Normal, we're replicating that tax computation report in the left side table, and on the right side table, we rerun those tax rate calculations by adding the Uptown TIF EAV. So we're taking the rate setting EAV of $881 million, we're adding the $28.7 million of TIF EAV. So it gives us a larger tax base. And so in doing these calculations, the change would have been, the tax rate would have been reduced by 3.2% if the Uptown TIF vanished and you had all that new EAV now as part of your rate setting EAV. If we look at the school district, same calculation. You take their rate setting EAV, you throw in the taxable value of the Uptown TIF, their tax rate would go down by 1.3%. So we do that for all the taxing bodies, and we tally it all up. And if the Uptown TIF vanished in 2017, come 2018, the total tax rate would have dropped 1.5%. So what does that mean to a median value home in terms of how much the taxpayer is actually flipping the bill for the Uptown TIF, or how much the taxing districts are losing from that median value home? And in this case, the property tax with the TIF in place is $4,409. If we got rid of the TIF, the tax bill would be $4,340. So their tax bill in this case would have gone down by $68 if the TIF disappeared. Now this is for properties that are basically within the TIF and they have all the same taxing bodies that overlap with our TIF. If I've heard the argument before that the taxpayer outside of the TIF or outside of the community is having to flip the bill a little bit for this TIF. And the answer to that is, yeah, probably are. We ran the same calculations for a tax code for a median value home out near Downs in the unincorporated area, where there was only a few taxing bodies that were the same. And that particular home would have paid $6 less if the TIF went away. They're paying some, but it would have been $6. $6. So what's driving up the tax rates? Well, it doesn't seem to be the TIF. So we took a look at the annual changes in levy requests for both the town and the school district. We ran these calculations for all districts for purposes of this show, though we're just comparing those two districts. And what we see here is while the town's rate setting EAV and the school district's rate EAV has been increasing at a pretty healthy rate above inflation, the town levy and the school district levy has been increasing at an annual rate that's even greater. So what's going on here? We didn't scientifically prove up every aspect that would be contributing to this, but we looked at some of the key things that stood out to us as what might be contributing to these rate increases. In the case of the school district state aid funding, it's been down $8.3 million annually since 2013. And it's not going to get much better than this because the District 5 is considered a Tier 2 district in the new evidence-based funding formula, so they're just basically going to get their gradual increases over time. They were held harmless as of 2017, but their revenue was so far down that hold harmless didn't do them much good. So that's one aspect of, well, down in the bottom you can see there, back in 2003, state funding represented 25% of the school district's total revenue. In 17, it's down to 16%. Also, the school district has been making a lot of capital investments over recent years, and I believe there's been several bond issues passed in that time period approved by the voters, and nearly 78% of their total tax rate increase is due to these capital investments. So in 2003, their bond and interest payments represented 14.2% of the district's total levy. It's now at 25%. So that explains a lot of the school district's levy increases. With respect to the town of Normal, the town's total rate increase is up 22% over this time period. You can see in here, probably the biggest contributing factor is retirements and pensions, which has gone up 55% during that time period. If you look at their operating expenses, the town's operating rate has actually gone down 38% over that time period. So conclusions on increasing tax rates. Obviously, the tax rates are increasing at a greater rate than the rate-setting EAV. This holds true with all the other taxing districts except for the county and the airport authority. Their tax rates have been held in check relative to the rate-setting EAV. We have shown here that having the Uptown TIF EAV as rate-setting EAV would have minimal effect on reducing the 2018 tax rate. So other factors are more significantly causing this upward trend. And in the case of the town and the school district, there's several of those big factors for which these taxing districts have no control over, and that is, the mandated level of police and fire pensions is mandated by the state. Town doesn't have any choice in it. And the level of state funding for the school district is dictated by the appropriations from the state legislature, and you can see that it hasn't been favorable to District 5 in recent years. So the analysis summary, we think the Uptown TIF has been a key financial component to revitalization. It hasn't been the only thing, but it's been a key aspect of the overall financing package. There's been significant private investment leverage. It's relatively small in size in terms of equalized assessed value, and we like seeing that. We don't like seeing TIFs that include too much property values within the community and the TIF district itself. So by virtue of that, it has a minimized impact on the taxpayer. And other factors are having a much greater influence on increases in tax rate. And then to repeat it again, all these TIF impact metrics are only validated or are only valid if we can assume that all this revitalization investment on the private sector side would have happened absent TIF. So what's the future of the Uptown TIF? I think most of you are aware of the fact that the town entered into an intergovernmental agreement with all affected taxing bodies last year. And in this agreement, the taxing bodies supported the city's effort to get legislative approval to extend the life of the TIF district by an additional 12 years. And that was in House Bill 1910, and it was signed into law June 21, 2018. But the key aspects of this intergovernmental agreement is that the Uptown TIF will run its course through the 2026 tax year, payable 2027, just as though, as it is now, and hopefully we get Trails East and hopefully we get a Trails West, which we haven't plugged in any assumptions on Trails West. but beginning in the 2027 tax year, only the tax increment that's generated by the parcels you see here in green will be used to pay for TIF eligible costs. The tax increment generated by all other parcels within the TIF districts, in essence, the balance of the TIF, will be declared as surplus and returned to the taxing districts during the TIF extension period. So in essence, it's like not having a TIF for the balance of the TIF. We're just using the extension to help get these last redevelopment projects done. So what's in the pipeline? Most of you are familiar with this, the Trail East development. I've read various estimates from 25 to 35 million for a 120,000 square foot, 5-story mixed-use building, retail restaurants on the first floor, office space second and third, and part of the fourth, apartments on the fourth and fifth. Again, you folks probably all know this, that it's the future consolidated headquarters for the Farnsworth Group, and other tenants includes AFNI headquarters, an ISU business incubator, food hall, our marketplace, I'm not quite sure what that is. And Windy City Wieners, I think their existing space gets knocked out and there'll be a tenant in this building. So that's another key piece of the vision and the master plan for downtown. If Trail West completes itself, the full circle will be finished and even more fantastic than what you see today. So in conclusion, the Uptown TIF, along with other public funding sources, has leveraged a large amount of private investment transforming Uptown normal, and it's obvious. And without TIF, none or very little of this private redevelopment or renovation work would have occurred. There's more to be done. Trail East is the next big one. And in the opinion of PGAV and others we've talked to in the economic development arena, we really think the town of Normal has done a heck of a job in advancing this vision and the plan for revitalization of Uptown. It's been incredible. And it's not just TIF that's helped make it happen. It took some debt financing on some major public infrastructure projects, but it's all coming together to being transformational. It's incredible. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Cummings.
Well, first of all, I really would love to say thank you so much for taking your time to deliver such a very detailed and thoughtful presentation. You know, I'm always wanting to share with the community, and just my background is in political science and political management, and understanding economic development is a passion of mine. You know, this is just showing how well we've done. And to some backstory, the 1970s changed how communities across this country did economic development. And I want to take a moment and a point of privilege to give some thought to Brookings Institute, which is a well-published educational journal, the Harvard Business Review, the Illinois Municipal League Review, as well as the National League of Cities Review, which the Illinois Municipal League is a consortium of local officials, including city managers, corporate councils, clerks across the state of Illinois, and the National League of Cities is of the like, but across this country. In the Brookings Institute report from 2018, they state that economic development incentives as direct financial benefits provided to firms to incentivize their opening, expansion, or retention. They go on to say that economic development incentives remain a core aspect across this country of local and state economic development policy. They also note that cities and states deploy a firm-specific financial incentive to nudge firm behavior in a manner in which it would not otherwise occur, as you so eloquently stated in your presentation as it relates to TIFs, in order to improve a given location's labor, market, tax base, physical footprint, or industrial advantage. Cities and states often use incentives to attract or retain firms in a specific sector, industry, or technology to develop or sustain competitive advantage. Other times, the purpose of economic development incentives, particularly at the local level, is to spur physical revitalization of distressed neighborhoods, as we've seen through the pictures through the presentation. The Illinois Municipal League also in 2018 used the town of Normal in a case study. And in their article that was titled, "How Small Downtowns Grow," they highlight today, even after assuming a more suburban orientation and with their dominance as retail centers have waned, these downtowns, us being one of them, Naperville being another, and Elmhurst being the third, have retained their roles as gathering places while also being sources of community identity. It's interesting we talk about parking lots or parking spaces as if they were so important. But interestingly enough, with our over 54,000 constituents or residents, and Naperville having 147,000, we don't fall too far behind in our downtown parking spaces. We offer 2,000 parking spaces, while Naperville offers 3,530, reaching a higher percentage per person per parking space. Also, interestingly enough, we came last in the number of acres in which we were initially ranked. We only had 12 usable acres in our downtown, which we now passionately call Uptown. We have now expanded to 27,000. But when you look at the numbers of the data, our total revenue percentages are not far behind Naperville's. That is something for us to be proud of. I am so proud of what we've done, and I'm grateful for the wise decisions that were made. As we know, and the Harvard Business Review talks about public-private partnerships, and they are now the new way. There's four different types of ways that economic development takes place. One of them is dedicated city funding. Another one is targeted state funding. Another one is federal funding support. And the last is public-private partnerships, or P3. The dedicated city funding is when we make the decision to set aside monies for economic development. Targeted state funding and federal funding, portion of that, we also talk about that when we talk about TIF. But these are the ways of economic development today. This is what cities across this country are doing today. And the way in which we do them have been an example that I have shared, especially sitting on the National League of Cities Community and Economic Development Committee. And I say that to say that I sit so proudly, but it hurts my heart when we turn our nose up to spite our face at the work that we've done. And so I want us to understand and take grasp of this. I hope this will be available for people to take a look at and to try to dissect, because there is a lot of information here. But it shows that we are making sound decisions and that we are doing the right thing. And it helps our community to grow and to be better, where people want to be here, where they want to work here, they want to play here, and they want to stay here. Thank you.
Ms. Smith?
Your mic, your mic's
First of all, before the meeting, I spoke with you and I expressed my frustration that you had not been able to release a copy of this to us in advance of the meeting, so we would have had a chance to study it and prepare questions, and you indicated that we could do so next week, but since council members are not in control of the agenda, that getting this on the public record is not an option for it. So again, in the future, if you do come back to give a report like this, I do think it important that we are in a position to study the information before we are asked to hear your full report and be a more informed consumer. In your report, you stipulate that the success is measured by the amount of private investment. And you provided an analysis of this project with 169, I'm assuming that's million, in private, and a combination of local, state, and federal of 90 and 37, which is a combination of 169 to 127. So it's about a 60-40 split between private and what is in essence tax funded, whether it comes out of our local tax rolls or what we pay to the federal government or the state. So is that 60-40 split some split that you see as reasonable for a measure of success of private investment in our TIF?
Well, in terms of local investment, you leveraged both private investment and grant money that you wouldn't have gotten had you not had these projects to build. So I see you leveraging 90 million to 218 or whatever that is, which is more than a dollar of or $2 of private investment for every dollar of public or local investment in this case. And while I'd like to see that ratio higher, given the cost of the infrastructure and having to do structured parking and so forth, I think you've done a pretty good job at leveraging $2 of private for every $1 of public.
And your report indicated that this began in 1999, and the original TIF was set to run to 2026, and that the TIF itself was a 20-year program.
It's a 23-year program starting in 2003 when the TIF was established. The 1999 date is when the town started coming up with the vision and the master plan for downtown. That took several years. There was a lot of public input and a lot of iterations of the plan and so forth until the final one was adopted.
And so we have already extended the TIF to 2036.
Correct.
And so any proposals for the development would come under the TIF automatically, or is that still subject to council approval of any project that might be intended for those spaces?
Any TIF-related development agreement would all have to be approved by the council. And though, let's just say, well, like with the microbrewery, if they were to have done a TIF deal, any agreement with TIF would have to end at the end date of the original TIF schedule. Anything that will go beyond the 23 years will have to be within that green area that I showed you on the slide.
Your estimate of the private money and the government support, did that include the estimated 4.8 million of rent that is going for town departments to be in the Uptown 1 project?
No.
It did not. Thank you.
Mr. Nord?
It did include, however, the net present value of the public assistance in the Trail East project.
Is it customary for you to discount amounts into net present value dollars as opposed to taking it in the original dollar amounts?
We typically take future estimates and bring it back to today's date.
What discount rate did you use and over what time period?
Finance?
If you're referring to
I think it was like
Trail
4
East
points. Yeah,
contribution.
right.
We use discount rate that's commensurate with our capital funding rate,
Which is what rate?
which is tax exempt rates around maybe 2%, 2.5%, 3%.
Mr. Hune, could you get on the microphone?
I'm having to kind of go from memory on this, but we discount those cash flows at a rate commensurate with our capital funding rate, which is essentially going to be right around tax exempt rates, right, like 3.5% to 4%.
3.5% to 4%. And what time period?
That was over the life of the TIF, yeah,
The life of the
The
TIF,
life of the remaining
23
TIF.
years, or the 17 years extension?
the extension.
12-year extension.
Yes, correct.
Because the trail, you're specifically talking about the Trail East project,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is in the development parcels area.
Right.
Which is part of the extended life of the TIF.
Right.
Mr. Nord?
What's the impact on the TIF when the town purchases property? You had in one of the diagrams the EAV level, and then the EAV level stays flat, and then anything new goes to, or anything in that EAV level stays going to the schools. What happens whenever the municipality buys property within the TIF and they no longer pay property tax? Who makes up the difference in that EAV?
Mathematically, that would be the other taxing bodies.
Other
The question is how much would that be? I don't know how much municipal, or how much private land did you buy since the TIF was established?
Well, the municipality from early 2000s assembled quite a bit of land for redevelopment purposes, and then the land that the municipality currently owns are the development parcels yet to be developed. So I'm not sure, Mr. Nord, if you're specifically referencing the the municipal
what
property now?
Yeah, but what he's getting at is that you're taking property that had a TIF base EAV for which the taxes on that would go to the various taxing bodies. If you convert it to tax exempt property, then the taxing bodies don't benefit from whatever that would have been. Now, I don't know the answer to it, but the question would be, would that be a lot of money? And number two, the TIF Act does allow for municipalities to do what's called a pilot, or payment in lieu of taxes. So under those types of circumstances, the town, at its sole discretion, could make a payment to the various taxing bodies to make up that loss, whatever that might be. I don't think that's
Right.
occurred.
A little over a year ago, when we gathered the data for, in support of extending the life of the TIF and the development parcel carve-out, we did have the analysis of the base EAV of the municipal properties in this development area. It was very small, because they weren't high,
Yeah, most of
high-value
these properties
parcels.
were pretty crummy properties.
Okay, I mean, there are, in my opinion, there's several. The parking lot where Trail East is, that was all purchased and acquired. There were structures there. Where Trail West was, there were structures there. The hotels, then where Wild Country was acquired. There's several older buildings that are around the circle that are still up and have been acquired. So, you know, there are quite a few. Just, it's nice to know that in the future, if we could include those in there, that way we can see what the effect was, because if the money was not going to these schools for 23 years or however long the town has had them, then the school has been shorted that amount of money and has either had to raise taxes to cover it or taken a loan. Somewhere that money had to come from taxpayers somehow. Is that correct?
I would say theoretically and mathematically, yes. Would it be significant? I doubt it.
Just depends on how much property we've purchased.
Well, I mean, I showed you the numbers here, that they are large numbers, and when you calculate the impact, it's 1.5%.
Okay. Also, within a TIF, if the town acquires property and they rent it out for either no cost, low cost, or where they're losing money every year, would that be a factor in how well a TIF is done?
You mean rent it to a private party?
Rent it to a private property for no cost or less than what property taxes would be.
If that affects the assessment of the property, and in this case, it would be purely the assessment on the improvements, because the land would be tax exempt if it was owned by the municipality, correct, Brian?
Most likely.
Yeah, so.
Yeah.
So if the if they're severely discounting it or, you know, renting it for $1 a year or whatever, you're not gonna have much tax increment off of it. Because if it's an income-producing property, it's gonna be based upon its income.
Okay. There's several properties that the town has that we rent for far less than what the property tax bill is on those. And that was the gist of my question. Or we have bought properties within the TIF and rent them out for $0. So that, I guess, income that the town could have received if they had not purchased the property would have come in through property taxes somehow. And since we bought it and we're not creating an income from it, then it actually costs us more to have it.
I think, Mr. Nord,
Was
too,
my
that
question.
there's an issue there that if the town has a property that goes to private use, that property is now subject to property taxes. The land may not be, I couldn't answer that, but the property itself is, once it goes to private use, is required to go back on the tax rolls.
Oh, yeah, no, that I agree, but if the town is now losing money because we're not collecting enough in rent to cover that tax.
That's not a TIF issue, that's our issue as a council to make those
Well,
decisions.
it's an expense. The town would not have purchased the property had it not have been.
But it's
for
not a
the
TIF issue.
Had the TIF not occurred, then we wouldn't have purchased the property. Well, that was just not included.
I presume it was part of some other economic incentive situation? Okay.
Mostly what those properties are properties that are scheduled to be demolished as part of the Trail East, Trail West project.
Well, it
And
says a holding pattern?
they're in a hold, and most of those rental properties have 60 to 90 days to vacate. And so it does depress the value of the rentals. Any other questions? Comments? Mr. McCarthy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for the detailed presentation. I'm one of the number geeks who appreciates the deep dive. And thanks everybody who's still here bearing with the deep dive on numbers. The more you know, the more you're informed about what's really out there versus a lot of misinformation that's out there about the TIF and how it affects everyday citizens. I got a couple questions that you were moving fast and I wasn't typing fast enough. So you mentioned about a percentage of the total EAV of normal increasing that came from the TIF district, the Uptown TIF.
Mm-hmm.
Was that 90%? Is that what you said?
91% was rate-setting EAV growth.
Okay.
The balance, 9%, was growth in the TIF.
Okay. So rate-setting EAV, what we generate taxes off of.
Right.
91% of the growth in our rate-setting EAV came
Yeah,
from
if you're
inside
taking a
the
look
Uptown
at your
TIF.
total EAV growth, 91% of that was rate-setting EAV growth, and 9% would have been the TIF EAV.
From the TIF, gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that. I wasn't sure what I heard. Gotcha. Also, so bottom line, and again, I was typing and not catching it all. Tried to get some pictures of, I'm assuming we'll get this slide deck so we can see it. Perfect. That'd be wonderful. Did we get a bottom line number of EAV increase since the beginning of the TIF?
Yeah.
That one I missed. I just wanted to hear that.
Yeah. I think the percent was 202%.
On page 25, Mark.
25? nearly 28 million.
Maybe 28 million.
So it went from 13.3 million, or excuse me, 13.7 million in 2003 to 41.4 million.
And so, as a reminder, EAV is 1/3 of the actual theoretical market value
Right,
of
right.
the, so it's,
Right.
the increase in actual property value is 3 times
Right.
that. Okay. 202%, is that common for TIFs?
I would say a TIF like this that includes a pretty big area, that's pretty darn good performance.
Okay. So 202% is good?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good.
I mean, the chart makes it look like you shot a slingshot. I mean, although if you study it carefully, you can see that there was a slowdown after the recession, but it picked up.
Yeah, I know we felt that struggle here in our own development community. Well, actually, I don't know that our local development community actually has recovered from that time period itself, our local developers meaning, so. I've got more, but I'll get those answered later after we get a little bit more of the information. Thanks again for the detailed presentation.
Ms. Lorenz?
Question that maybe is less numeric and more qualitative. How do I reconcile, how do we reconcile a real disconnect that maybe in a lot of communities, and I think in ours, about the understanding of what's happening in these sort of districts of tax incremental financing? And that disconnect is really probably best phrased in my mind as, is this spending or is this investment? And sometimes, depending on how passionately people feel about it, they put an adverb in front of that and call it reckless spending, right? Because, you know, there's new storefronts going in and a new building and you know, amenities of a green space and a children's discovery museum, and those are our situations. Somebody must be writing a giant check somewhere for this. That's one side of it.
Right.
The side you've just told me sounds more like a lesson in financing, where you're leveraging dollars and creating that slingshot.
This is a long-term investment on the part of the town and every other affected taxing body.
It is a long-term investment.
Mhm.
Say that again?
A long-term investment by the town, as well as any other taxing body that overlaps this geography.
So.
Because the idea here is to take an area that was depressed and obsolete and had all sorts of problems, turn it around, and it's going to take a lot of investment, not only just public investment, but private. And at the end of the day, 23 years from now, you have something to show for it and the tax base is increased. But again, in the whole scheme of things here, this Uptown TIF is tiny relative to the overall tax base. And so I would say you've been wise to keep the TIF very focused and not make it, you know, huge and include the entire community. There's TIF consultants out there that have TIFed the entire city, which is idiotic. But here you focused on a very targeted area. A lot of investment went into it, but you're seeing the results of it. And so 5 or 6 years from now, you're going to see the windfall of EAV. But remember, you saw my analysis. The impact has been 1.5% overall. So when this TIF goes away, the various taxing bodies are not going to see this gigantic windfall, and they're not going to be able to build new tracks and, you know, new buildings and all that kind of stuff. It'll be a positive influence, but look what you accomplished. You created this city center. That's awesome. and everybody can be proud of it. So I look at it as an investment, it's not spending.
I think that's what, just to recap, I appreciate you answering this more qualitatively. I think that is the $64,000 question, or maybe $1 million question. How do you distill your 60-some slide deck into an elevator speech that says just that? And I think that's the challenge, quite honestly, that is facing this body, this town, this community, of how do we tell this story that is one of investment and not reckless spending. That's what I hear you saying, because
Right.
I can hear reckless spending from very, people on the street.
What
And then
about lining the pockets of developers?
Oh, that too.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. But you got a few more. Winners and losers? Yeah, got that one too, right.
Well, staff has discussed with us about the possibility of putting a narrative to this thing, which I think would probably be helpful for those that want to dig into it. But if we do a narrative or do anything beyond what we've done so far, it definitely needs an executive summary that tries to put this down into one
Into an
snapshot.
elevator
It's hard.
speech.
It's going to be
Yeah.
hard to do.
I
but-
know. But sometimes less is more, and I think
Right.
if we just go with the qualitative high points,
Right.
we might be able to get the story more accurate. So thank you.
Mr. Nord?
To echo a little bit off of Ms. Lorenza's points, I do agree that in Uptown, it does look dramatically different than what it did years ago. I remember when it was like the pictures you had shown. And people do say that it does look nice. I agree, it does look nice. It's very nice out there. What I hear from the community, though, is, in the TIF, there's so many projects that have gone on. It's not all projects are bad. There are select ones that have been questionable, that people have gotten behind one way or the other. And when they're not in agreement with it, those are the ones that we hear about. And so, no, not everything that was done in the TIF was bad. I love the green space. There's just a few projects that I don't see the investment that the taxpayers will get out of it. And I just wanted to say that I don't believe everything in Uptown is bad. Just a few projects are questionable. You had mentioned in your presentation that the bonds are partially paid by the revenue from the TIF.
Correct.
The town took on a whole lot of debt for this, and the debt extends far past when the TIF ends. Who pays the difference? If it's not coming out of the TIF? And who pays the bond debt? Because the bulk of it's not going to be paid till after the TIF ends.
Well, I'd have to defer to Mr. Hun on the specifics, but you have, in essence, the luxury of paying for certain TIF-eligible expenses that were paid for up front with certain bond proceeds. So TIF is taking care of some of those TIF-eligible expenses. Those bond proceeds also paid for things that weren't TIF-eligible, like the convention center and some other improvements. I don't even think the parking garages are being paid for with TIF, correct?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, but in any event, when the town did the financial analysis as to whether or not they could afford to issue that debt, they had to look at it to the extent how much TIF could pay for and how much TIF wouldn't pay for. And as I understand it from the auditor, your debt is within reasonable check. Even though you're a home rule municipality and you don't have debt limits like other municipalities, I think your debt load is comparable to any other municipality in terms of what its limitations are. I think it's less than 10%. So when the TIF revenue gets done paying for its part, the other bond payments are the general obligation of the town. And so far, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but you've been able to abate those payments altogether
That is
ever
true.
since the get-go?
Yes.
So it doesn't look like you've had trouble paying those bonds.
No, but eventually we will have to start paying those bonds, and we'll have other projects that are going to come up, and we eventually have to pay that.
I will add, and council is aware of this, with each bond issue that the town has gone through, we have designated the revenue source to pay those bonds back. So that's already predetermined on how those will be funded.
Okay, so if that's predetermined, do you account for interest, since we know how long it's going to be that the money's going to be out there in the TIF analysis?
Well, as Andrew mentioned before, they look at their cost of capital. And so we look at the principal and the net present value of future costs. So we like to look at it in today's dollars for it to make sense.
Okay.
But yeah, you know, the time value of money, of course, if we count those future interest payments and bring it all back to 2017 without discounting it, that would be unrealistic to look at it that way.
The additional challenge, and Mr. Weber, you can clarify this, or Mr. Hanson could, but the additional challenge would be the private investment is looking at present value. We don't know the financing rates associated with all the private investment either. So it would be difficult to compare apples and oranges if you're looking at public investment compared to private investment if we don't know what their financing model was.
Oh, no, I wasn't worried about what the private sector was doing. How they're financing it is up to them. It's just, what's the
Right.
total dollar amount that the taxpayers are going to pay?
That is true,
up
but
until
when we're
this is
talking
in?
about what the municipalities and the public investment has leveraged, we're trying to compare apples and apples.
Okay. Will we be able to email you questions, because this is the first time we've seen it, and I'd like to watch it on video and kind of get more questions? Can we do that? Is that appropriate?
I think it would be appropriate to channel those emails to Ms. Reese and let her forward those on. That would be the appropriate way to do that.
They'll all get a copy of the presentation, and then we're going to post it to the website tomorrow for the public. So the public will have access via our website, and the council will have the presentation tonight. And obviously, I speak with Mike far too often, but I'm happy to coordinate any conversation through City Manager Reese as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions that follow up. And I apologize, this gets a little awkward when you get into trying to give a presentation like this. One, it wasn't ready until 3 o'clock this afternoon, and two, if I give it to you without any background or explanation to it, it might lead you down to some misconceptions that would waste a lot of time on it. So I'd rather you see it first and absorb it, and then, you know, what you don't think is correct or you don't understand, I'd be happy to try and clarify any of this analysis with you. As
Mr. McCarthy?
I started out before, the concept is pretty basic and simple, but it does get a little complicated.
I just want to lend my support to what my colleague, Ms. Lorenz, requested. For geeks and nerds like me who like this stuff, I was on the edge of my chair. Some of you out there were gone in about 48 seconds, I think, of this presentation. So I think, you know, a summary is best we can do that. Maybe it's not one page, maybe that's not achievable, but some summary, if it's going to be out there available for the public, a website, that some attempt at a summary to reduce this down be undertaken, so that the lay public who isn't motivated like I am can walk away with a good snapshot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Weber, thank you for your presentation. It was required a lot of paying attention. I felt like I was back in school. But
I hope I didn't bore the heck out of you folks.
No, it really answered a lot of questions, I think, for people.
Good.
We have had a request to take a restroom break here.
Oh.
And we will do that. I would say about 10 minutes. I will tell you that at the end of that break, I will not be returning. I have to leave very early in the morning to go to my son's birthday party, a milestone birthday in Chicago. That milestone number is a very scary number for me. I'm not going to embarrass him with the saying that out loud, but it's a very important day, so I will be leaving early.
Okay. 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 Do I move? We're just running from here.
Is that
I'm moving.
Yeah.
All right.
Typically what'll happen is what happens is typically
That's good for you.
they converted it to a PowerPoint and I didn't know that until so.
Well, here's the PowerPoint and the PDF.
I apologize for that issue that you had.
I thought it was my PDF.
I had the PDF in front of me and I was like, that's not what it looks like. And those typos aren't online. So I knew there was
Jesse converted it to, for whatever reason. I don't know why, but
It's okay.
it doesn't matter, and
No, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
Wait a minute. I know you had a long trip. I've got this.
Just wanted to explain this. This is one of our new promotional things like this. But these are coasters of our coasters.
Nice. Is that like the, what's that Jim Gaffigan joke about? Not as good as that By Menon, but, you know, it's Hot Pocket or whatever. You know? That's awesome.
He has a new show, so.
I know we're going to go see him in Champaign. In fact, we're taking my son. He's here October 17th. It's a Thursday. And there's still great seats. We're like in the third row. I got a pre-buy. And
Is that at the university? Or?
yeah, it's at State Farm Center, the Assembly Hall.
Yeah.
And there'll be plenty of seats because that's a huge arena.
Because we went and, you know, I'm not really big into comedy acts, but who's the guy that does the puppets?
Oh, Jeff Dunham. We saw him in February in State Farm Center.
Oh, there?
Yeah.
We went and saw him at Enterprise.
Oh, sure, Enterprise Center, sure.
It was hilarious.
Yeah, if you ever get a chance, so the State Farm Center brings in great acts.
Yeah.
And we saw Garth Brooks there. We've
Yeah, I
gone to other
remember
kinds
that.
and easier to get tickets than it is in St. Louis typically. Better
Probably.
seats and they're cheaper.
Yeah. All right.
Get some rest.
Safe travels.
Yeah, it's what that's Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's, this is the first. Well, it's
Okay. All right, thank you.
You know, one is good general education on how this whole thing works. And then two, so how the heck's it doing? Yeah, it's doing well, he said it's doing. Wow. I'm like, well, wait a minute, is that good? I'm assuming 200% is good. Well, if it was me personally, 200%. I love that kind of ROI. Yeah. Got it. I've got this. Thank you for coming. We will. What's that? And we all you guys were. Yeah. Good. Oh, there's It's kind of. And he's bailing on it. All mine. Want to be here to
Seeing y'all. We're not going to be here.
So this morning, my mom texted me, said the airport. Okay, I'm sitting at work. I didn't say that. That's exactly what I want to say. I'm so happy. Yeah, I still think we're going to discuss.
All right, we're having fun, right?
Well, you were very good. Take of it. I'm going to go back. That is true. Yes, we did. Yeah.
All right, I guess you're all stuck with me now. Right down there? There?
No, I'm reading back the story. It's going to be a French thing. It's already done.
Okay.
Don't take my seat. I know. I saw you.
Scott, oh, where'd Scott go?
He's coming.
All right, we're going to resume our council meeting. Next up is the omnibus vote agenda, but I need a move to get it off the table and back from the discussion.
So moved.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Our omnibus, oh, thank you, voting. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Lorenz.
Aye.
Mr. Preston.
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy.
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings.
Aye.
Mr. Nord.
Aye.
Ms. Smith.
Aye.
And the motion carries. I always want to move faster. All right. Our omnibus vote agenda are items that are considered routine in nature and will be considered as one vote, one motion, unless a member of council requests to remove an item from the agenda, and will do so. Ms. Smith.
I'd like to remove items A, F, H, and I, please.
A, F, H,
And I.
I. All right. Mr. Nord.
I'd like to remove items B and C.
All right. Anyone else? All right. So that leaves items D, E, and G on the omnibus agenda. I have to read those. And they're not coming up on the screen, so I'll read them. We have D is a resolution authorizing the city manager to solicit bids through the town's energy broker for electricity and natural gas commodities for the town-owned accounts and execute energy service agreements with the lowest responsible bidder. Item E is a resolution accepting bids and authorizing the execution of a contract with H.J. Epple and Company, Inc. in the amount of $29,600 for the Constitution Trail asphalt resurfacing project. And item G is a resolution waiving the formal bidding process and authorizing the purchase of refuse containers from Schaefer Systems International Incorporated in the amount of $27,454.75. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Cummings.
Aye.
Mr. Nord.
Aye.
Ms. Smith.
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz.
Aye.
Mr. Preston.
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy.
Aye. And the motion carries. First item removed from the agenda is the approval of the minutes of the regular council meeting of August 19, 2019. Ms. Smith.
I move approval of the minutes of the regular council meeting of August 19.
Second.
Ms. Smith.
I'm requesting a revision to the notations about my comments under concerns. Item 9, on page 4 of the minutes, the notes only indicate that I gave an update on the working group and encourage people to connect with Connect. My notes from that meeting indicate that what I also included, and I wanted to go into the minutes, is my frustration that Connect is moving forward with their RFPs for new electric large buses before the working group completes its work. And a request also that Normal name a member to the Connect Transit Board so to restore our full representation of this board.
All right. Anything else? All right, call the roll.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Point of order, we're approving the revised minutes.
Yes.
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye. And the motion carries. Item B, a report to receive and file a town of Normal expenditures for payment as of August 28th, 2019.
I so move.
Second.
I so move.
Excellent.
Second.
Mr. Nord.
Just a few questions on the expenses for the CMD, or the CDM, the Children's Discovery Museum. It just lists the expenses. It doesn't identify which ones are to be reimbursed by the foundation. Could we see about having some sort of indicator put on there showing that these are ones that are going to be reimbursed, just for transparency?
I'm not understanding the for transparency comment, but I think I had shared in past conversations, Mr. Nord, that this is a check register, and we track our expenses and reconcile with the foundation each year. They pay us once a year based on our invoice. And the foundation covers capital expenses as well as expenses funded through grant support. In terms of changing how we identify these, I'm not sure if it's worth changing our system as such. I know that you've been very concerned about making sure the foundation reimburses the town for the adequate amount, and we can share that reconciliation with you each year if you'd like. Most of the expenses for sure on this particular, I don't remember which page we're on here, but the expenses reflected in this report generally are associated with program expenses. Those programs include registration, which are revenue producing. So they might have grant support. So, there's a lot of things that go into the mix here. So I'm not sure what the hopeful outcome is if we identify every single expense of the foundation, or excuse me, of the operation and attempt to link that back to a foundation or a grant. Or if you're comfortable, if council's confident in the reporting and the reconciliation, and we give you the annual update of how much the foundation reimbursed the town. I'm cautious about what that is. I don't care.
Ms. Lawrence?
Oh, well, I would just maybe ask the chair to, if I may, address Mr. Nord with a question that maybe he can respond to, and that is, do you have some deeper concerns about the integrity of the CDM Foundation?
No, my concern is not about the integrity. It's just the expenses come across, and we as the town council have no idea if this expense is something that that is going to be reimbursed or not. So it's simply just to clarify, so that way there is no question. Whenever the expense is entered, is this a taxpayer covered expense, or is this something that we are expected to be reimbursed? I mean, that's clearly what it is. There's no question. It's just, as the expense comes in, we don't know if it's being reimbursed or not.
And I think part of what the answer was is that there's a reconciliation report done every year, and rather than on an item-by-item basis, it's this is what the foundation owed us. Did they pay it or not? And there's a detail, obviously, to that report, but there's a reconciliation done rather than try to find a way to move an accounting system into the check register is a difficult proposition from an accounting perspective.
And it
So
may
I think
just
that's
be an understanding
the answer is.
issue. Is it? Am I understanding it then when the expense is entered in, we don't know until the end of the year when the final audit is done, whether it's going to be reimbursed or not? Or is that decision made when the expense comes across the desk?
Well, again, during a budget process, we approve a budget to spend money, and so again, this is an item that's been previously approved in the budget process, which we're about to go through, and so from the foundation perspective, right, repaying anything based on what the specific project is already done in the accounting process, and so I'm not sure I'm following the confusion, but Ms. Cummings.
I'm going to speak from actual being on the board because I'm very familiar with some of the process in which, as being a board member, how some of this takes place. So yes, we would receive this at a total at the end of the year, but at the same time, we took note ourselves of what we were having as far as upcoming costs, whether it was a new exhibit or anything that would have to require us to pay the town back. We actually would include that in our budgeting ourselves. And I have yet to ever have an issue because we also worked very closely with Andrew and his team, and they were always at every meeting to make sure that we were on task. So I think it's kind of a slap in the face of not only our town staff to act as if there's maybe some questionable behavior, but it's also a slap in the face of members and board member emeritus, those who have served on the board and have done well with the board and has gone out here and helped with fundraising and looking for grants to help us find the additional funds to be a successful Children's Discovery Museum. And we make sure as a board that we take care of what we owe the town so that they're not having to cover those costs. And every fundraiser that the Children's Discovery Museum does, they try to ensure that they can cover the costs. Great example are some of the exhibits we have today and things that are to come where we ensure we can cover the costs and that there will not be a deficit to the town. So I think that this is really a report to us of the checks that are being written. I think to get into accounting is beyond where we should be and in our role that we serve.
Mr. Preston.
I would just suggest that if there's a will amongst council members at all to try and include reimbursable expenses under the CDM by the foundation within the context of these biweekly expenditures, that the same rules should be applied to every department, listing here, that anything that's reimbursable should, by that, by that thought process, should be identified. And frankly, I think that is far beyond what we should be asking of staff every 2 weeks. And so as a result, I would not support doing that just for CDM because, if CDM, why not every other item in here? Since we're on the topic of these expenditures, just a side note for staff that I'm sure you're already well aware of, but it is kind of how this printed this week. It is kind of difficult to read the total line down at the bottom because of the shading.
Yep. Okay. Duly noted, Mr. Preston. I shared that.
Okay.
Nothing else?
I've got.
On B?
Yes, on B.
Okay.
The curtain cleaning repairs, just for education, it's almost $16,000. Is that an annual expense, or is this just like one time over so many years?
That particular expense, that's for the normal theater curtains. I'm not sure what page that's on, but If I recall correctly, that project included not only cleaning, but it included some maintenance on the curtain system, as well as applying a fire retardant to the curtains, which this is all done by a specialized contractor. The last time this was done, I believe, was 1999.
Okay.
97, maybe, 1997. It's been 22 years. We can tell you with quite a bit of certainty that it will be less than 22 years the next time this happens.
That's good.
So we're about ready to celebrate the theater's 25th anniversary, and we want to make sure it is ready for the celebration.
Okay, thank you. So it has lasted quite a while. We've gotten our money out of it. Thank you. The Uptown Partners, there's Wi-Fi equipment in your answer, and I apologize because I didn't get the responses back. This was for a new lease. Is there a new lease that came about that they're getting Wi-Fi equipment?
We have executed lease for the application of the Uptown Wi-Fi equipment on the top of a private building at the intersection of North and Broadway. And I can share a copy of that lease agreement with council. I don't have it certainly with me this evening.
Okay, I thought it was like a lease for a property.
No,
That's what I didn't-
it's for an installation on top of a roof that supports the Uptown Wi-Fi system.
The College Avenue repairs, it's almost $45,000. You had mentioned in your response that that was maintenance. Is this annual maintenance, or is there some big repairs that had come about?
I can ask Mark Clinch for specifics there. We do invest quite a bit in the decks, all three of our Uptown decks, to make sure that we prolong their useful life as long as possible. So I'll ask Mr. Clinch to articulate this project.
Good evening. Yeah, that's correct. It's basically just repairs and maintenance. We had a formal assessment done in previous year by Walker Consultant, and they identified a bunch of deficiencies. And basically that's a result of that, trying to clean those things up. So it's about a life cycle extension more than anything.
Is it something that's occurred over a period of time, or is this an expense that's every year?
Well, like any facility, the best we can do is slow deterioration. So to say there wouldn't be an annual expense on any structure, especially a parking deck, which is largely an exterior structure, I think it's safe to say that there will be an annual expense. Likely in future years, if we don't come up with a mechanism to fund those things along the way, they just get worse. So we are doing what we can with what we have currently.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be less in the future than $45,000 a year.
Actually, for structures of that type, and this is getting into a capital conversation, which I won't go down that road with you. But current funding levels for what we actually have for assets of that size and magnitude, we currently have $150,000 in the current approved budget for O&M for all three decks. And we assign that proportionately to the size and the age of the deck. The funding at that level currently is basically just, it's not even enough to keep up with deterioration. So really, we're doing the best we can with what we have to slow it down to the extent possible, but it's not going to keep pace at that rate to extend the life cycle of the deck. It will deteriorate faster than $40,000 can put back. And that is by and large a much bigger piece of the capital conversation we will likely be having as part of the budget.
Yes, thank you very much. That's very clear. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Those are my questions.
That's it? All right. Anyone else? Please call the roll.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye. And the motion carries. On to item C. We have a resolution approving a salary schedule adjustment for classified employees to reflect a cost of living adjustment. Mr. Nord.
I move the resolution approving a salary schedule adjustment for the classified employees to reflect a cost of living adjustment.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Mr. Nord.
So my concern is not the cost of living adjustment, giving it that, or authorizing that. It's the rate that we're using. We're using the Consumer Price Index Urban Consumers, CPIU, which this is an average of the towns in the U.S., or of the urban towns in the U.S. Well, Normal's cost of living is at a lower rate, at least according to the research that I did. We have a 10.7% lower cost of living. So why aren't we adjusting our cost of living to what Normal actually experiences rather than someplace else that's more?
Well, Mr. Nord, I can simply indicate that the town has historically, for the 28 years I've been here and the 20 years or so prior to that, when David Anderson was the city manager, Mark Peterson was doing the calculation, that we have always used the CPIU, which is based upon all urban consumers. And so if council desires that we explore making a change in that formula, we can certainly do that. This is just a historical formula and the approach that we have used, always. So.
I would recommend that the council consider making the cost of living adjustment based on what Normal actually experiences, because it could be in the favor of the employees, or it could be more or less than what the indexes we're using. That may change over time.
Just a point for information, that CPIU is a broad base of urban, so some of that is far less than ours and some of it's above ours. That's why municipalities like ours use an average, because some experience, to your point, lower cost of living growth and some experience much higher. And so an average makes sense, but, and it's a standard published that most municipalities use, but, so, anyone else? Please call the roll.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye. And the motion carries. And that brings us to item F. We have a resolution to accept proposals and award a contract to Cone, Inc. for replacement of the water treatment plant freight elevator in the amount of $219,450. And Ms. Smith.
I moved resolution item F.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. I have a motion and a second. Ms. Smith.
I was in contact with Ms. Reese prior to the meeting for some clarification, because this came down to, yet again, a sole bidder. But there was such a disparity between the rejected bid that there was an attempt at a bid that was quite low but was incomplete, and then this final bid. And this also was indicating that the replacement was a new type of construction of the freight elevator that was intended to be less subject to the water damage and erosion that the current device is carrying. So if, for the record, could someone please explain, we got 29 years out of the previous one. The life expectancy on this stainless steel is 30 years. What more are we getting with this new one, and is it still, in fact, 30-year useful life for the new one?
We believe it's a 30-year useful life. Ideally, it would be longer. We're going to plan on a 30-year life. In particular, to the proposals we received, we did receive a proposal from American Custom Lifts that was a low number comparatively, but it was incomplete. And when we asked for additional information, just to clarify, they chose not to provide additional information, so that was rejected. And we are recommending Kone for the elevator. It is currently out of service based upon the state declaring it to be out of service. And it was in poor shape and is subject to, basically it's in condition because of the moisture. It's in a very poor situation. So we believe the stainless steel structure that we have received proposals for is going to last longer. So it is a significant investment at the treatment plant. However, it is what we use to move chemicals from one space to another.
So clearly beyond its useful life, if it
Yes,
was deemed
absolutely.
a hazard and shut down by the state of Illinois, clearly it's not designed to be there for 29 or 30 years. Ms. Lorenz.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. I just want to add that I took a few minutes today. Thank you to John Burkhart for allowing me to stop by the water treatment plant to physically take a look at this elevator. And it's in really bad shape. I mean, obviously it's not even working right now, but in terms of the corrosion that's on and around the whole entire cage and space is really quite bad. I mean, just as we were even standing there, and Mr. Burkhart was noting, an area that was corroding, and he just tapped it with his toe, and it made like the hole even bigger. So, our chemicals. You talk about line items on the bills. The chemicals are some of the most expensive piece that's coming in and out of the water department. It's that and your staff basically that make up our water department. So we've got to make sure that we can accept this inventory safely, that it's not some band-aided and bubblegum held together elevator. So to me, the one very far low bid was basically the elevator only and some assembly and your installation required. So I don't think that was really the right thing. Plus that second bidder didn't even respond when we asked them to complete it. And then the difference between the 219 and the 167, I think for all the components to be stainless steel, after what I saw today, if we got 29 years out of that, I have no doubt that we'll get 30 years or more if we just go the extra mile a little bit and take care of the investment that we're making, I guess probably on a weekly or monthly basis with hauling that stuff in and out.
Mr. Nord.
So I understand the question right. Between the two bids from the one contractor, the useful life of both options is the same number of years. Is that correct?
Well, I'm looking back at the report to see. I don't recall that, but I'll ask
Burkhart, if you
Mr.
wanna-
Burkhart if he wants to come up and clarify the difference between the two elevators components that were bid.
The cheaper option that Coney supplied had very few stainless options in it. While we got 29 years out of this one, that was 29 years to failure. It probably should have actually been replaced about year 25. With as much steel that would still be in the cheaper proposal, we would anticipate somewhere around that 20 to 25 year useful life, replacing it before failure. Again, as Ms. Reese said, we're expecting 30 plus out of the stainless. We're calling it 30 right now, but again, fully running a steel one to complete failure and getting 29 years, we see 30 plus fairly easily out of the mainly stainless steel structure.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yep.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye. And the motion carries. Which brings us to item H, a resolution authorizing the renewal of the Employee Group Health, Dental, Life, Accidental Death, and Dismemberment Program. And that is for Ms. Smith.
I move approval of the resolution for item H.
All right,
I second.
I have a motion and a second. Ms. Smith?
Again, I've been in touch with Ms. Reese, and the documentation indicates that part of the challenge with our costs going up is that there have been a number of claims above the 100,000, but yet not reaching the level of 150,000 that triggers the reinsurance for that coverage. And then notice in the audit report that we're below the recommended 25% funding level for this self-funding. What was the rationale between self-funding health insurance versus just going to a plan and paying premiums and letting somebody else do it? Are we coming out ahead?
Well, each year we try to take a look at that, not necessarily in terms of going from a private or a self-funded plan to a fully funded plan, but we do look at options all the time. We went to a self-funded plan in around the mid-'80s. And for decades now, we have felt very confident in our program, and we've been also, I think, pretty nimble to react to situations as they arise. However, in the grand scheme of things, we're still a relatively small group. And so when we have years like this past year with some sizable claims, it does impact our fund balance. The target fund balance of 25% is a target that we established ourselves because we thought that was a pretty good cushion. It's a pretty conservative cushion. It's basically a rolling period of our 4 highest months of claims, whereas that's a pretty conservative cushion. So every year, and you'll see this when the Finance Department and Mr. Hune do the financial trends report in 2 weeks, we take a deep dive into the health fund and share with council concerns we might have, whether or not we think the target of 25% is a little too high. Maybe that's a little too conservative and such, so we look at that each year. Additionally, we have a very good relationship with Mike Wojak and the Horton Group, which is our broker, and Mike is here this evening. They spend time each year marketing our program to get the best possible renewal numbers that they can, and to ensure that we are providing a good benefit for our employees, but also at the best price possible. So it's a deep dive each year with the team.
Well, I thought in the documentation that there was a statement of an effort to restore the balance. Is that through actual claims experience improving, or are there budget dollars that you're going to be requesting to help supplement the funding levels?
I'm going to ask a question for clarification because I'm not sure I understand. You said restore the balance. Could you?
To the 25%.
Thank you.
The fund balance.
Thank you.
We are not considering taking money from the general fund at this point and plugging it into the health fund to get us to the 25% balance. We are, however, looking at any kind of cost-saving measures and enhancing wellness. We always are focusing on wellness to minimize the risk of higher claims in the future. And then also looking at what other options we can consider, whether or not it's the higher deductible health plan and pushing people to that. The other bottom line focus that we have all the time with our group insurance program is helping our employees and our retirees, because they're in the plan as well, to become more educated consumers of healthcare. And if we can help them understand what questions to ask and also focus them, try to get them targeted towards generic prescription drugs, or we adopt a formulary plan for our prescription drugs, things that will help the plan control costs, then we are always looking at those. those strategies.
And that additional budget amount is the town's premium increase. It's not reflecting the employees' adjustments, correct?
That is true, and you're referencing the budget impact on the first page
Yes.
of the report? Yes. The budget impact reflects the cost to the town in terms of the cost of this benefit. Most of it is incurred by the general fund, but we do have employees in the sewer fund and the water fund, and so those two funds pay their share appropriately.
Okay, thank you.
With this plan, we've got a relationship with a private company where we manage their HR costs and healthcare and things like that, and they are supposed to reimburse the town back all costs. We've talked before, and like with HIPAA, we're not able to, or I guess the insurance companies are not able to share information. So will this plan allow for this private company that is supposed to reimburse town or taxpayers all costs, will it allow that to happen? Can we follow that contract that says this company is supposed to reimburse all costs?
Well, you're referencing Serban.
Yes.
The community broadband network of which the town and the city and Illinois State University, we all serve on the board of Serban. And the town has an agreement with the Serban organization, and we are functioning per the agreement. Specifically, in regard to the 3 employees that work under the Serban umbrella, as I've indicated through past conversations with Mr. Nord, we are not able to carve out claims for 3 individual employees because that would violate HIPAA. And so we have, as an organization, accepted those 3 people into our plan for all benefits. They function as if they are town normal employees in all regards. So there's just no ability to carve out 3 people's claims. And that wouldn't be per the agreement.
Oh,
We
no,
function today per the agreement, so.
I understand that. That's per HIPAA. In this action report, it mentions that there are some claims that have been high, which I assume those are individuals. If they are, and since normal is self-insured, taxpayers pay for that insurance pool. There is no ability for us to follow the Serban contract and have Serban reimburse the town because we'll have no idea how much these people that are not town employees, they just happen to be classified that way now. There's no way Serban can actually reimburse us the costs because we can't tell them.
As that group does not reimburse us for those individuals' claims if they file claims. That is an accurate statement. I do want to just be clear, though, that I think you just made a statement about everything's at the town's cost. Majority of the health fund is funded by the employer for certain. This is a benefit program. Employees do contribute by paying premiums, as do retirees pay premiums into the health fund as well. So.
Yes, it's more the claims being reimbursed.
Right. And as a self-funded program, the goal, this isn't a profit-making venture. This is the goal is that the premiums that are paid into the health fund are enough to cover the cost of claims and to cover fixed costs, including stop-loss coverage, reinsurance coverage. You had referenced the high claims that are sizable, that don't meet the $150,000 stop loss. Those claims could be from an employee, as you mentioned. They could be from a retiree. They could be from a covered retiree's spouse or dependent. They could also be from an active employee's spouse or dependent. So we can't identify who had the high cost claim. It's just a covered life in our plan. Just to clarify, because you indicated that that would be an employee, and it could be.
It could be someone
any
else.
covered life.
Sure, sure. So this plan will not allow us to abide by the Serban contract, essentially.
I believe the Serban contract probably indicates we follow the law, so I would say we do abide by the Serban contract. I don't know how else to say that.
We'd have to break a law to get to individually reported health expenses, if that's what, if I understand your objection. I may not understand your objection, but we would have to break HIPAA law to be able to carve out individually identifiable health expenditures for reimbursement, if that is your point.
Oh, no, that is exactly my point.
So we'd have to
That
break
the
HIPAA
only
laws.
way we can honor the Serban contract is to break the law, which means the contract, we can't do that. This contract needs to be looked at. Because
I
Serban
disagree.
cannot,
I disagree.
is not able to reimburse us the full cost to the taxpayers.
In the course of some email communication, Mr. Nord, I had asked if that was your goal, if you wanted our agreement with Serban that to basically these 3 employees to not be considered employees anymore. So if that's the outcome you're hoping for, then I'd prefer to target the conversation to that rather than their potential health claims.
Well, it's not making them not employees, it's honoring the contract and getting the cost reimbursed, which is what the contract says, plain and simple.
Ms. Lorenz.
Thank you. I want to echo what Ms. Reese just, I think, was starting to suggest, and that is that if the larger issue here with our colleague, Mr. Nord, is more to look at the merits of how the Serban contract is structured, let's do that with appropriate parties involved. There isn't anybody from Serban here tonight, so I just feel like this is going in a circular fashion, and in that regard, I would like to call the question.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye. And the motion passes. Moving on to our final agenda item under the Omnibus Agenda is I, resolution approving an agreement with Morneau Chappelle for Employee Assistance Program EAP services. Ms. Smith.
I move resolution item I on the agenda.
All right.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Ms. Smith.
Just for the record, because the documentation isn't clear, the bid quotes $12,005, but the budgeted amount is $13,275. So, Ms. Reese, could you just please explain the selection of the higher number?
Absolutely. The budget impact on page 1 of the report toward the top indicates that we budgeted, in our adopted budget, we presumed there could be an increase in the EAP service contract. So we budgeted for $13,275 for this renewal. Basically conservative budgeting in hopes that that would be enough to cover the contract. When Morneau Chappelle gave us the proposal, they gave us a number of $12,500, basically $31 per covered life per month. And so it's coming in under budget by $725. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm satisfied.
Good note to end.
Excellent. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye. And the motion passes. Before I ask for a motion for adjournment, do we have council concerns or comments?
Can I just say one thing? At some point?
Yes, absolutely. Mr. Nord.
The corn circus that happened, brought my kids to that. That was fantastic. They had a good time. The Gamify Circus, my kids spent more time there. They would not let me go talk to any of the vendors or anything. It was a great kids event, a very good kids event, and they really enjoyed it. So thank you very much to everyone that was involved with that. The second comment is on the Connect appointment. Still, that has not been appointed. Is there a plan B to be able to make an appointment?
You know, Mr. Nord, I'm the mayor pro tem, not the mayor. That power rests with him, so I suggest that you have a conversation with the mayor about that when he returns. Anyone else? Ms. Smith?
I just wanted to comment on the recent Labor Day parade. Mr. Nord graciously provided a hay wagon to Lifesil, so a number of people that would have struggled to walk the entire route were able to get a ride, and to Conan with Lifesil, who pushed my tandem bike up Lee Street when we struggled. Thank you goes out to him, and to Jazz Up Front, who graciously opened up their restrooms to the parade participants as we were forming up. Thank you goes to them. It was a wonderful event.
Ms. Reese?
The only other thing I was going to mention, maybe to close out the meeting, is this Saturday is the Household Hazardous Waste Collection coordinated by the Ecology Action Center. This year, it's a new process. They are taking appointments, and so you can go on the Ecology Action Center website. There's also another website that you can access, hhwmclean.as.me. But I would say it'd be probably easier just to go on the Ecology Action Center website. So you can find the appointment schedule from their website, and we encourage everyone to consider participating in the Household Hazardous Waste Program.
You stole one of mine too. Perfect, thank you. The last thing I just wanted to shout out is a couple meetings ago, I highlighted a resident coming to speak on behalf of an infrastructure project, which I don't think I'd ever seen ever happen before. Just a shout out to town staff, probably engineering, water department, and a few others that were involved in less than 30 days. That project was, we had equipment on the streets, a lot of dust up and some inconvenience, but along Jersey and Crescent and Kent and Thomas, I know those residents were very appreciative of the water main replacement and water main modification project up there. So thanks to the water department and engineering and whoever else was for getting a very, very prompt response to a yes and funding vote up here to a project getting underway. We really love to see that, so thank you very much. With that, I'll take a motion for adjournment.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Just kidding, I can't do that. Call the roll.
Mrs. Cummings?
Aye.
Mr. Nord?
Aye.
Ms. Smith?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye, we are adjourned. Yeah, you're gonna be Mr. Ellie Chris. Not as long as I keep getting that reaction. Thank you. We'll go. Then by all means, give him his pen. While you're on that, will you give him his LLB catalog? Oh, that's Kevin. How did I?